Welcome to episode 17 of An Understanding. This episode will be about Andrew Johnson. If you like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits and enjoy.
May 26th, 1868. The impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. He's in the White House. He's in the Oval Office. He's chilling. He's not a part of the actual impeachment trial itself. In fact, this entire section probably won't even involve what Andrew Johnson is specifically doing, because Andrew Johnson is going to be the first president impeached in this country's history. The first impeachment of the president will occur after a whole bunch of chicanery. I don't even know how you want to explain it, but for the most part, this is an impeachment trial of political means and not actual constitutional breaking means by any sense of the imagination and word. Although interpretations will effectively end up being brought up, this effectively will be a bit of a political hit job, because Republicans do not like Andrew Johnson, who has basically stopped them in every sense of the word to try and achieve what they believe is their version and variation of civil rights. And ultimately, the trial is not going as well as had anticipated. On the first Article 11 specifically, of the impeachment that they're attempting and trying to do, they are attempting and failing, at least with the first article, of 35 yay votes and 19 nay votes. Specifically enough in order to basically abstain from convicting Andrew Johnson in the impeachment itself. They need 2/3 majority specifically, and they're just off by one vote. On May 26th, about 10 days after the first vote, they are to vote on the other two articles. And these articles in particular are the ones of the Tenure in Office Act, etc., etc., a whole bunch of different things. And ultimately, it is up to a couple of Republicans. 7 of them are very worried. Notably, one, Edmund G. Ross, who would be the decisive vote. Democrats themselves, in this very manipulative, one-sided presentation of the evidence against Andrew Johnson, are effectively going to vote, all of them in particular, nay on these two articles for a lot of reasons. And a lot of people are curious of what's going to happen. You see, there's a whole bunch of political chicanery that's going on in the background, but ultimately all it takes is one vote by Edmund G. Ross, who was all over the place, to be quite honest. You don't know how he's going to vote. On this particular article, he was a little bit worried, but you don't know how he's going to vote on these two specific articles. So when he goes up to Congress and they ask him specifically, yay or nay, he says nay, to the surprise of many people. Some people will say that, there was improprieties, that there's a whole bunch of different people that were bribing one another in order to get Johnson free and acquitted from his impeachment trials. And a whole bunch of different people, including John F. Kennedy himself, wrote a book called Profiles of Courage, in which he actually devoted an entire chapter on Senator Ross specifically. And, there's a whole bunch of different people that reject that, opinion. And it depends on how you look at it. And it depends on how you look at the entirety of the information. But Andrew Johnson would escape, barely to become the first president that would have been impeached. This is going to be Andrew Johnson's ultimate lasting legacy, along with the botched attempt of Reconstruction, and ultimately, being the president that's going to be after Abraham Lincoln. And we're going to be here to figure out, is it all true? Is everything that Andrew Johnson is what he is? Andrew Johnson is this country's 17th president, and he's going to be one of the most historically significant and, I guess you could say, history-changing presidents that this country has ever seen. Really setting the stage up, really in a lot of ways, for the next 40 to 50 years of history in the South and in the North as well. And really showing that even after the end of the Civil War, there's still a lot of issues that need to be hashed out with the North and the South and the Union and the Confederacy. Andrew Johnson's a fascinating human being, another fascinating individual. He's basically, in a lot of ways, kind of like Abraham Lincoln, but the polar opposite, ideologically speaking, to Abraham Lincoln. Both men who grew up from very poor, humble beginnings to effectively become great, fantastic orators and speech makers, and ultimately really prominent politicians in their respective states. For Abraham Lincoln, it was Illinois, and for Andrew Johnson, it was Tennessee. So, for him, he's basically like the Democratic version of Abraham Lincoln in a lot of ways, instances, and forms. He's also one that is really confusing, to be quite honest with you. Not complicated, that's probably not the right word to say, but confusing. Historically speaking, a lot of people say he doesn't like black people and he's a devout racist, etc., etc. It's complicated, and ultimately, at the very end of the day, I think, I'm just going to say it now, he is a devout racist for the most part. But at the very same end of the spectrum, it's complicated. History goes all over the place. There's a lot of issues with slavery, and his opinions on slavery kind of go all over the place. And a whole bunch of different people that defend Andrew Johnson do have some merit when it's basically like, hey, he's just one who protects the Constitution, and I think we're going way too hard to protect all these black people, etc., because the radical Republicans are trying to destroy the white South, and the white people down there, and it's just like, you're taking one constitutional right away from another constitutional person, and it goes into a whole bunch of different discussions, to be quite honest with you. But ultimately speaking, he is a president that will become president at quite possibly the worst time in history. Basically the worst person for the worst job, ultimately speaking, which is unfortunate because life might have been different had he been a president much earlier, or even at a different time that wasn't now, for the most part. And who knows, things might have been different, but history works the way that it works. Andrew Johnson is going to be the president that's going to oversee, at the very least, the beginning stages of the initial Reconstruction era plans within this country's history. The Reconstruction era, effectively the era and time when the South is being rebuilt, North being rebuilt, and America itself is being rebuilt, and a new union is being created from the remnants of the Civil War. One that's going to allow black people to have their own constitutional rights and beliefs, etc., etc. And unfortunately, Andrew Johnson is going to be the first president that is going to be impeached as well. We have had 3 presidents that have been impeached. One that almost got impeached. The first one being Andrew Johnson. Obviously, the second one that almost was Nixon, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, in one of the most ridiculous impeachments in fucking world history, to be quite honest with you. But ultimately, Andrew Johnson's is actually pretty ridiculous when you really look at everything, for the most part. And he's going to set a lot of things up. He's going to set a lot of things up for how, in a lot of ways, we see the machinations between the North and the South and how they're going to go effectively for the next 40 to 50 years really develop and begin during the entirety of his presidency. It's going to be back and forth. The South's not going to give up any gains, and the North is going to have to fight tooth and nail, and it's just going to be a battle between really just states' rights, individual rights, etc., and just the anger and frustration that the South's going to feel because of what the North did, and vice versa, for the most part. This country may have just had a civil war, but it's nowhere near done. There's people that are mad, and things are just happening, and Andrew Johnson's going to be the first president, unfortunately, that's going to get the first crack at it, which is unfortunate because it sets up a lot of problems. History works in weird ways, to be quite honest with you. The bringing the lead up to the Civil War itself probably had some of our worst presidents in this country's history, and then we had one of our greatest, and then just as soon as we reach the peak, Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated, and then we get left with Andrew Johnson. But to be honest, I don't know. once the more research I do about Andrew Johnson, the more he becomes more of an interesting person, an interesting character. And I'm not saying I like him, but I'm saying I understand him, I think, a little bit better, and I empathize with him. And I think, once you understand people, you tend to understand different things. But, once I go through this and I say it out loud and I speak, the truth to power, and I really want to understand who Andrew Johnson is, my perception might change. But, he's one that I think I have a solid opinion on, in which case I'd say that he just was not a good president and failed in many regards as the executive in chief in office for the most part. But, just like a lot of these other presidents that I've been doing this series on, I tend to understand them more. And even if they did fail, I tend to understand them a lot better. And with Andrew Johnson, I don't think it's going to be any different. So, I hope you guys listen. I hope you guys like and enjoy it. And let's start with Andrew Johnson's childhood.
Andrew Johnson was born in a log cabin in Raleigh, North Carolina on December 29th, 1808. His parents were Jacob Johnson and Mary, or Polly, McDonough. I don't know. McDonough, it's like McDonald, but McDon and then enough. Yeah, basically, that's just how it is. His parents and his lineage are pretty fascinating. Very long line. A lot of his family were part of this country for quite a long time. Scottish, Irish descent, and English on both sides, I believe. And his father and grandparents were kind of, they had some land, some property in some states, but ultimately, I'll put it to you this way. They're broke by every sense of the imagination. By the time Andrew Johnson's father was basically, Andrew Johnson's father, and was on his own as his own man, he was a very broke and very poor individual, also illiterate as well. I just want to point that out. And Andrew Johnson, for the very first many years of his life, really until he became an adult himself, was going to be very, very, very poor. There's a whole bunch of different stories, unfortunately, about Andrew Johnson because he was illiterate. A real track record of his early upbringing and his youth is very difficult to find. There's one story in particular of his birth, when his mother gave birth to him. She was like in the middle of a wedding ceremony because they were both porters and laundry people, I guess you could say, janitors in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was born and named after Andrew Jackson, who was a very prominent person in North Carolina, from North Carolina or South Carolina, Tennessee. Complicated, like I said, with Andrew Jackson. But ultimately, that's one of the stories, although that's not a proven story, and most biographers don't really talk about it. But that's just one little thing that I found. North Carolina, at this point, by the way, is the capital of... Raleigh, North Carolina is the capital of North Carolina. That sounds pretty obvious, but it's one of the more fascinating small little capitals. Most people, basically like government officials, etc., the governor himself lives there, and he kind of refused to live there. It's basically one of the most underdeveloped capitals in the country. Yeah, maybe 1,000 people live there, and a lot of them black, a lot of free black people actually, but not too many. And for the most part, it's just basically backwoods with like maybe one or two hotels, a little bank place, little things like that. And everyone, it's basically like the perfect little small community, and it's nice for some people, but ultimately for people who are attuned to big city folk and big city living, it's not the most conducive environment to really live in. And in fact, a lot of the government officials kind of made technicalities to not actually live there, but for the most part, it made a lot of people, even if you were poor, you had a place within the community. In fact, Jacob Johnson would become a porter. He would basically be an important person in the community just by being I know vagrant's not the right word, but a very, very dirt poor individual and person, which I just want to point out too. I think his childhood reminds Abraham Lincoln of his childhood in a lot of ways. Both these people would have very humble upbringings, but they would just grow up diametrically different in a lot of instances, in a lot of ways. And I'll explain that when I get to, progress through his childhood and his life. Andrew Johnson's upbringing is one that is incredibly poor in every sense of the word. Like I said, his parents were, I'll get to his parents in a little bit, but for the most part, they were very illiterate and very poor, and unfortunately, there were no public schools in Raleigh. So he really didn't have really any semblance of an education whatsoever. And for him, he grew up a poor white boy in the South, in a southern town, and his family was in a lowly position. And obviously, there's rich and poor discrepancies throughout. And in one of the books, there's this group called the Five Williams, who were basically the aristocratic elite within Raleigh, or within the southern environment, that really controlled a lot of the things and had a lot of power, etc., etc. And Andrew Johnson gets to see things like this that ultimately ends up shaping his perspective and opinion. For him, it's more so along the lines of both, I don't like these people, but at the same time, I see these people as wealth. I see these people as success, and if I'm going to achieve success, I should probably be like them. A lot of people see things, especially during this particular point in time, that if I want to escape poverty, I gotta go about doing this and doing a whole bunch of different things along those lines. But for the most part, he just had a poor, relatively speaking, normal childhood. He tried to help with chores around the house with his mother while both his parents worked. And he also grew up with a lot of black people. Raleigh had a lot of black people, and he played with a lot of the children there. And it's unfortunate because even back then, he was influenced, and I don't want to say manipulated, but even back then, poor whites were far higher, I guess to say, or they were perceived and believed to be much more superior than, say, even free blacks, etc., etc. And he basically just did all the things that a normal young boy would normally do around, the early 1800s, during the Monroe the Madison and the Monroe presidencies for the most part. And he grew up loving to hear war stories and battles. And like I said before, for young Andrew Johnson, some even himself believed that he was named after Andrew Jackson. When Andrew Jackson wins his battle in the Battle of New Orleans when he's about 7 or 8 years old, he's just basically just like, it's people and beliefs. And when I said Andrew Jackson's one of the most influential presidents of all time, it's just little things like that where, he can influence a small, poor Southern boy who will eventually become the 17th president of the United States. I think it's really brilliant. And Johnson is going to be one of these people that, sees Andrew Jackson as the incarnation of the American dream. I was once poor, but I can make it, and you can make it too. And for a lot of these specifically Southern, I guess you could say, rags to riches stories, Andrew Jackson is the ideal individual, and Andrew Johnson is the one that specifically ends up really taking it in stride. His parents are very interesting, very fascinating. Jacob Johnson himself, very fascinating long line of family, but ultimately himself a very poor, very illiterate individual, and by all accounts, truly a really good man, like every sense of the word, a good man. He would die, I'll tell the story in just a little bit, of a heart attack when Andrew's about 3 going on 4. And it's a fascinating, complicated story. He was a very sober individual, very hardworking. He was what was it? The town constable or the city constable, the sexton and porter for the state bank. And for the most part, just a good man. I can't even explain how good of a man I think he is. Faithful, incredibly honest, known for his honesty. In fact, the day he died, he actually ended up saving 3 men, specifically. A couple of people who were in 100 Mills Pond, I believe. What was it? The 3 men fell in. It was a bunch of these people. Thomas Henderson, he was a publisher of the Raleigh Star. This guy, Henderson, Henderson's friend, William Peace, and a Scottish visitor named Callum, who was one of the heads of the local mill. Basically, the boat fell over. Most of them couldn't swim, so Jacob Johnson actually who was at the pier at the particular time, leaped into the water and grabbed and saved all 3 of the men. And then later that day, I believe, it was believed he had heart problems, and by the time he went to go ring the town's bell, he dropped dead. And I think he went to ring the, oh, it's noon, ding, 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 oh, and then he dies, weakened by the incident. Henderson, the Raleigh Star guy, actually wrote that, you want to talk about a man of humble action, esteem, honesty, and a friendly disposition. There's no one better who had shown kindness and humanity than Jacob Johnson. And it made things difficult because Polly, on the other hand, is another interesting person. Not much is really specifically known about Polly, at least in the early goings, but she seemed like it's relatively the same person. It also seems though a lot of stories about Polly tend to be just out there, probably because of just gossip in general. And Polly was basically a young lady, about 20 when she married Jacob Johnson. And for the most part, did a whole bunch of what I would say is poor and very oh, how dare you kind of jobs, I guess you could say. Basically, just working as a really I can't even explain it. It's basically just her going from being a laundry person, et cetera, going from place to place, doing whatever job she possibly could, and rumors start amounting that she might have had some infidelities because Andrew Johnson doesn't really look like his father, and that that Andrew Johnson actually his actual father might have been this guy. He was a lawyer or a judge or something like that. He was a member of the Tennessee Supreme Court, William Ruffin. Although basically none of these things really materialize. There's no actual proof of any of it happening, and most of the time would just basically happen during political campaigns and et cetera, that a lot of these supposed stories come out. So Andrew was the youngest of 3. Yeah, he had an older brother, William, and an older sister named Elizabeth. And when her mother was single for a while, it was very difficult. She would effectively end up having to relinquish some parental control and basically relinquish a lot of things during this period of time before she would actually remarry. She would marry another poor white guy named Turner Daughtry. He was an okay father. There's not really a lot about him specifically. Just the fact that she remarried, and Andrew would live with a couple of different people and stay with his mother from time to time. But a lot of it was partially, first and foremost, to get her children opportunities to find future success and career work. William, the older son, was apprenticed to Colonel Henderson, who was the guy who Andrew Johnson's father had saved when he fell into the river, and also apprenticed him at this guy named J. Shelby. He had a tailor shop in which Andrew basically got an opportunity to tailor there, or whenever he was ready to be tailored around the age of 14 or so. But for the most part, it was already set in stone that that's what Andrew Johnson was going to be. And for Andrew Johnson, it's a hypothetical, promising opportunity. But he was a wild child. He was a bit of a fascinating young lad. I don't want to say he was a bully. That's probably not the right way to say it. I just think he had an upbringing that was not very conducive for really any young kid. He had no structure. He's going from place to place and really didn't have a lot of father figures in his life. And he was a very good-looking, young, tough, strong young boy, and he actually formed a gang with his cousins. They were known as the Jesse Johnson Boys. Specifically, it was his cousin's gang. So whenever he stayed with his cousin and his Uncle Jesse, They had a little small shanty actually by the Hunter Mills Pond where all the kids would play for the most part. Things were very tough and things were very strong, and he would do all the things that other boys do: play ball, fishing, swimming, and just basically be a mad lad in a lot of ways, if that makes any sense. But for Andrew Johnson, he really wanted to learn. I think above all else, he, when you're actually deprived of something, and like we take learning for granted today, but back then, most people couldn't read. And for Andrew Johnson, he just felt so behind and deprived of schooling. He had a weird zest for learning. So for him, whenever he could, he would go to a whole bunch of different places. In the beginnings of his tailorship with Selby, when he was about 10 years old, he would go there sometimes and just where his brother was apprenticed and meet a whole bunch of different people, a whole bunch of public citizens who would come in, and he would just listen to their conversations as they would talk politics, talk about debates, and talk about other citizens. And there was this guy, this local intellectual, Mr. William Hill, who would read books to the workers while they were basically, doing the needles and thread. And the one book that he read that he absolutely loved was The American Speaker, or it could be known as Columbian Orator. It depends on how you look at it. But Johnson basically liked it so much, and Hill actually grew to kind of like Johnson and basically just gave him the book. And the book contained famous speeches from famous statesmen, English, American, and this is where basically Johnson gets his real first attempt and glance at an education.
So I think it's really interesting because when you look at how people grow up, presidents, etc., one thing Andrew Johnson's always really well known for is being actually a fantastic orator, a really good, fiery speech maker. And a lot of this upbringing really comes into play when he's a young lad, and watching all this stuff happen, even before he was a tailor or apprentice at Selby's tailor shop. He got to see a lot of it happen in front of him, and got to see a whole bunch of different people learn how to communicate. And I think that's what really helped him progress in a lot of ways throughout his entire life. It's just his time watching people and watching how people communicate, adapting, and basically finding his own little speech pattern that he's going to be that's generally just going to be very conducive for him. He also learned how to read in a lot of ways, or at the very least, specifically, at least knew his ABCs. It was Selby's foreman, this guy named James Litford. He was the one who basically believed to have taught him, at the very least, taught him the alphabet, at the very least, for the most part. So there's a whole bunch of different books, and I'm just going to basically just say that North Carolina law back then for apprentices is basically borderline slavery. Just depends on how you look at it, but there's just a lot of things that have the same semblance of slavery itself, where you're because for him in his contract basically stated for his apprenticeship was that from age 10 to 21 he would basically be obedient and just serve in any meaningful way to Selby, and while Selby, on the other hand, will basically teach them to read, to write, feed them, house them, and prepare them so that they themselves could be ready for the trade. And, if they ran away, they were liable for basically capture in a lot of ways. And they were, for the most part, kind of just like, convicts in a lot of ways. And it was very, very difficult. When Andrew Johnson gets the opportunity to become the second apprentice, his older brother William first became an apprentice to Selby in 1818. Soon after, Andrew ended up joining him. And for years, he would basically just face a whole bunch of different needs. He had a weird arrangement. Andrew Johnson and his brother didn't actually live with the tailor. He actually lived at home with his mother. Mother had specific stuff, so they would do their tailor stuff, come home, they would do their chores and help around in any meaningful way that they can to help the household, etc. But for James, it just became tedious, became difficult, and above all else, it just it became very clear that this is just not a situation that he wants to be in, a situation that he wants to live in. And he's like, I don't like this life, and I think this is where him learning and him having an education really becomes a bit of a detriment, because he's just like becomes a bit of a rebel, a whole bunch of different books he's reading at this point. And whenever he could, he tried to read and practice some of his oratory skills, and he just hated it. He hated it. Like I said, a rebel, and I'm just like, I don't like being a slave to this tailor that, he would be a bit of a thug and release some of his tension doing thug-like things. And it's very interesting on one particular night where things kind of go awry. One night, and at this point, Andrew Johnson's about 15 years old, and he just deeply, deeply hating his life at the current point in life, and he decided he was just going to be a bit of a ruffian. There's a whole bunch of different theories about what happened, but effectively, Andrew Johnson pelted his neighbor's house with pieces of wood, breaking some things. Bunch of different reasons why. One of them is possibly because he wanted to impress the neighbor's daughters, or just because he disliked her. But effectively, she basically came out of the front door and was like, "If you guys don't stop doing this, I'm gonna get the police and I'm gonna sue your ass." And Andrew and his brother, and two other boys, they decided they were going to flee Raleigh. The group would basically just run away. And I'll put it to you this way, it's not very good. And Selby himself posted a reward in the paper, $10 for their capture. And 100%, there's no argument in any way, shape, or form, this is 100% Andrew Johnson's work for the most part. He is the ringleader in all of this. And yet every single one of them was determined for the most part to make it out on their own. The Johnson brothers specifically themselves, they headed southwest to the town of Carthage, and for a little bit, for at least some time, Andrew found employment as a journeyman tailor. Sorry, not carpenter, tailor. In a very small village, with basically the only thing that was there was a courthouse. But this would be a very difficult couple of months, where Andrew Johnson, because technically speaking he is a criminal in a lot of ways, would leave and go from town to town for quite some time. Even going as far as to settle in another state in South Carolina, and basically would just do this for the next 2 years of his life. His brother and him would, I don't know if his brother and him were together or apart, but it seems at the very least that if he was out on his own, he was out on his own in South Carolina. While in South Carolina, he settles in a small town, the town of Lorenz. This is where he would spend a majority of the 2 years, basically on the run. He settled in a small little tailor shop, a very local, I mean, tiny tailor shop. And let me explain. Town Lorenz it's basically between two rivers. It was actually really, the purpose that he was there is because the town itself is really just all over the place. It's surrounded by a bunch of hills. It's very hard to get to. Basically, it's just a well-hidden town. So he was able to really hide there for quite some time. Andrew Johnson worked really hard. He actually ended up developing a bit of a small life here, from age 15 to 17. Did really good work. Did a bunch of wedding coats, did everything you could think of, and really was a fantastic tailor. Started getting a positive reputation there, even though not a lot of people knew who he was. And basically every single chance he had a book in his hand. He always found all the books that he could and would read day in and day out. A couple people that would actually live with him in like the similar boarding houses would often say that he just had a book in his face every single day. It's around this time too, while making a coat for a local school teacher, he ended up meeting one of a lady named Mary Wood, and he wanted to woo her. He made a quilt for her, all these little things like that, but he was a very, he didn't really date women or really knew how to woo people for the most part. So, very quickly he tried to ask her hand in marriage, but she turned him down. First and foremost because she's like, oh, it's so sudden. I don't think I'm ready for this. And then her mother's like, you're a penniless tailor. You're not going to marry my daughter, which basically just, broke Andrew Johnson in a lot of ways. And, a little bit emotionally broken, a little bit difficult for young Andrew to, he's a young man. He decides, I need to do something because I need to actually be more than just this poor tailor. And he decides, I'm going to go back to Raleigh and I'm going to clear my name. Andrew Johnson, he returns home to Raleigh, and he's basically talking to his parents, his and his stepfather, and they're kind of just worried about him. They want to make sure he's going to be okay. Like, what the fuck have you been? He's just like, hey, I've just been trying to do my own thing. You know what I'm saying? But I'm home. I'm back in. I'm going to try and clear my name in North Carolina. Because you have to understand, it's not like anything's federal kind of things going on, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's not like if you went to another state, you're a criminal nowadays. But back then, it's kind of like if I went from North Carolina to, say, Tennessee, where he would go, it's much more acceptable. And it's not like, okay, you're a criminal in North Carolina, but you're not a criminal in Tennessee. The states are still very separate by this time. And it's around this time, too, Quincy Adams is president, so I just want to put that in the backdrop specifically. But for Andrew Johnson, look, I just want to point that out because I think it's really interesting, like these presidents are actually here, but they're not presidents yet, while other presidents are in office as presidents, It's kind of like, George Washington is president when Andrew Jackson is doing his thing, Sorry, I just want to point that out. I just think of those little tidbits that I think of when I comprehend history, I think are really interesting. But anyways, Andrew Johnson, he returns home. He's basically like, I'm going to try and right all the wrongs that I possibly can. So first he goes to James Litford, the former foreman of Shelby. He has his own tailor shop at this particular point in time. And he's like, hey, where the fuck have you been, man? He's like, yeah, I'm just on the run. And the foreman guy, Litchford, tells him that Selby is no longer in the area. He had moved about 20 miles to 30 miles into the country. So he spends a day's travel to go and find Selby. And basically, Selby's like, where the fuck have you been? And let me put it to you this way. The argument that they have, the debate that they have, because Andrew Johnson's basically like, can I buy my freedom? How much money is it going to take? What do I need to do in order to be free? And Selby's like, if you pay me this, then, you can do it and be free. But it's such an unreasonable number that goes well beyond even effectively just normal standards. It's basically like, how much for that Toyota Civic, or not Civic, sorry, I'm fucking dumb, that Honda Civic, and he's basically like, $200,000, and fucking Andrew Johnson's like, okay, now you're just being completely unreasonable for this 2004 Honda Civic. Like, what are you doing, man? And Andrew Johnson's stubborn as all hell, and he's just basically like, I'm not doing this. You can go fuck yourself, Shelby, and decides that he's just going to set out on his own. And he decided to leave North Carolina for good. And he talks to a couple of friends about a whole bunch of different things that he's going to do. He packs up all his stuff, socks, shirts, and leaves actually in the middle of the night, and decides he's going to go west. And a lot of his family is very apprehensive, but he's determined to strike out on his own. So he leaves, tears in his eyes, saying really just goodbye to his mother for the last time in a lot of ways, or at least some might perceive it as the last time. But Andrew decides he's leaving North Carolina for good and is heading off into an unknown future in Tennessee. The journey from North Carolina to Tennessee is a very fascinating journey. I'd actually like to see this as like a movie or like a TV series. It would take the better part of a year to go from Raleigh, North Carolina to... He was trying to go to, I think, Nashville. I think he was just trying to go to the big cities, but ultimately ended up in Columbia, Tennessee, which was a sprawling. It was basically a county of Maury County where James K. Polk and his entire family and his upbringing really materialized there. James K. Polk being much older than him at that point. It's actually a really fascinating journey. Most of it was really on foot for the most part. I mean, he would travel hundreds of miles on foot. Stop whenever he could at the help of just truly kind people, including the Sheltons, I believe they might have been called. Effectively, it was a Taylor. My brain's not working right now. James Shelton and his wife Mary, or Mrs. Shelton, they basically took him in for quite some time in Columbia, Tennessee, where he effectively ended up staying there for a while and really built a small little community and a little bit of a home there with a whole bunch of different people. And just to make it back to the journey real quick, it's really fascinating. He met a whole bunch of different people, met kindness, was able to read books, and Andrew Johnson, I think in a lot of ways during this journey, was trying, but also fundamentally understood that I think people are good, human beings are good, etc., etc. And it's fascinating to really look at it when I look at how people go through things and go through life and the challenges. At one point, he takes a riverboat for several, dozens of miles, and it's just a really incredible and fascinating journey. So while he's in Columbia, it's a very flourishing town at that point, including the rise of banks, and there's a whole bunch of different banks, that are being created. And Johnson's really prepared to make a life in Columbia. Then he gets a letter from his hometown and from his family. Basically, his mother and stepfather are basically having a lot of financial troubles, and they wish for him to come home. So Johnson's just like, I literally just fucking left a year ago. Whatever. So he ends up going back home for a little bit. He hitches a ride with a whole bunch of different people. Another fascinating journey. And once he returns home, the financial situation is pretty dire. Basically his mother's job's basically gone. His father, I believe, is too old or too physically incapable of the hard, 12-hour labor that is required of him to basically make a living. And he can't make a home in, Raleigh, North Carolina. So, thinking that he was going to basically just see his family for the last time, it's very clear that things are, he's going to be with his family. So he decides, okay, mom, stepdad, you're coming with me. So he basically takes him back all the way to the west for more opportunities, and his family effectively joins him on the journey back to Tennessee. The journey was very trying for the Johnson family and clan, along with his parents, the other family members, part of his stepfather's family, the Daughtries, and his mother's brother, so his uncle, Andrew Johnson's uncle, would join in some of the family there too. And it was a pretty big clan, to be quite honest with you, and the journey was pretty rough. One story in particular, I believe, like a panther or mountain lion had actually entered their campsite, and they're like, "Oh my god, what the fuck!" And then they scared the mountain lion away with fire. And the journey was very difficult with a lot of people. And basically, they were trying to make their way back to Columbia, but ultimately, they arrived upon Greenville with a two-wheeled cart with all their worldly belongings, which wasn't a lot, but they arrived in Greenville. Named after Nathanael Greene, yes, the same Nathanael Greene, and they spent the night there. And the next morning, Andrew Johnson walked around, asked a whole bunch of different people. That's this guy named John Brown. I don't think it's the same John Brown, but they asked a guy named John Brown what was happening around town, went to like a whole bunch of different places, and found that this place actually had a job and had a lot of potential opportunities, especially at the post office, where he met a whole bunch of different people. And Johnson basically started working first as a tailor for George Boyle Tailor Shop, where he basically started working very, very hard and would eventually, I believe, create his own tailor trade for the most part. I don't know if he actually creates his own shop at this point. I forgot my notes as I'm reading this in the top of my head. But for the most part, he's basically creating his life and the life of his family and helping support basically his entire family, while the men go to find jobs and the women tend to the houses that they eventually are renting at this point. It's also around this time too that when he first enters town, he sees some of the girls, and he sees a very beautiful lady named Eliza McCardle. Eliza's with a couple of her girlfriends who saw Johnson, and basically there's a bunch of different stories about how things happen, but Andrew Johnson himself said when he first saw her, he just said, he was kismet, he was hooked, it was love at first sight. And apparently to Eliza, on record, apparently she said to her mother that, Andrew Johnson, that was the man, there goes the man that I'm going to marry, or there goes my beau, girls, mark it, and she's a very, very fascinating individual. So Andrew Johnson and Eliza McCardle, they would meet, fall madly in love. She was 16 when she met Andrew Johnson. I think he was only about just a couple years older. I think he's about 18, 19 years old at this point. She's the daughter of a cobbler, and really didn't care. She just loved Andrew, and they would marry on May of 1827, and I'm just going to talk about the entirety of the relationship for the most part, because by all accounts, they were very happily married, I would say, for the most part. She would suffer from spouts of, lung problems. A lot of people believe it's tuberculosis and a whole bunch of different things, but they would have a pretty happy marriage for the most part. Eliza supported her husband in every single endeavor that he really pursued. She also taught him math and really tutored him in writing and reading in a whole bunch of different ways. And she really became the individual that was pushing him in every sense of the word to implore in his writing, etc., and reading. She was a very shy person in general, and throughout her entire time with his political rise, she really didn't do much in terms of being there as a hostess. That was left to, I believe, the oldest daughter, Martha, who usually served as like the White House hostess, for instance. But she still supported her husband and supported her husband during the presidency. And their marriage was pretty solid. They would eventually have 5 kids together. First one, like I said, being the oldest, Martha, that would come a year after their marriage in 1828. And they would have 4 more kids, 2 boys, another girl. And then their last child, Andrew Johnson Jr., coming quite a while after. I think 24 years after. So when Elias is about 40, they would have their last child around that point. And you know what? While we're here, I'm probably just going to talk about Andrew Johnson and his perspective on black people and slavery, just very briefly, before we get into basically his entire political rise, everything, his eventual presidency, because I need to make it very clear. Andrew Johnson's very complicated when it comes to black people and slavery. I think for him, he grew up personally not having any particular prejudice towards black people, and I think he just ended up being instilled in him at a very young age that white people were just superior to black people. I don't know if it's specifically because of like pure, I was born this way or anything like that. I just think he was a naive and grew up in that particular lifestyle and in that particular way. He himself would be a slave owner and would own 10 slaves throughout his entire life. He would free them in August of 1863, a year before, technically speaking, that all slaves were supposed to be freed, technically, with the 13th Amendment. Or at least in Tennessee, the laws were very, very, very finicky especially with the Emancipation Proclamation. But for the most part, it's very complicated because, like I said before earlier, when I was talking about Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson is not a friend to black people or to, slaves. That being said, it was more so like, I think he had a bit of an inner turmoil and an inner battle, I think, in a lot of ways with how he perceived black people in slavery. Because I think he wasn't naive about the 13th Amendment, a whole bunch of different things. He's one of the very few politicians, Democrats specifically, and Southern Democrats, that chose to stay in the Union. And that's huge. That's big. He chose the Union and said he'd rather abolish slavery than effectively destroy the country, et cetera, and states' right. Which is huge. So that's something. And that's something that should always be accredited to Andrew Johnson. And by all accounts, for a lot of his slaves that he did have, he basically was a compassionate and familiar relationship towards them. He actually ended up buying the actual entire family of one particular slave in order to keep the family together for the most part. So it's very complicated, and a lot of these, owners are very complicated. Does that mean he was a terrible human being? No. Like I said, he's just a product of his time, product of his era, and above all else, he's just a complicated individual, and the entirety of his presidency is going to be very complicated with how he treats the South, because it's undeniable that he still views the white man better than the black man. But I think he's fighting with himself to try and change for the country and change for the future, and really just kind of wrestle with his youth and all the things that he grew up with and that he was instilled with. So ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's complicated, and he's not the worst person, but he's not the best person at all by miles and miles and miles and miles. And ultimately, one that could not have been a worse person to be president, unfortunately, during the Reconstruction period. But that in itself is a very complicated issue. But my whole functional point being that for Andrew Johnson, slavery is just so much more complicated than I think even most people would admit. And for him, I think he's just constantly fighting with himself. So anyways, back to Andrew Johnson and his life. He actually leaves Greenville for a little bit, comes back with his family, and he's basically like, damn it, Eliza, what that booty do? And, love brings him back ultimately, and he decides he's going to stay in Greenville and marry Eliza in May of 1827. Little tidbit, the reverend that would basically marry them was Mordecai Lincoln. Specifically, he is the direct cousin of Thomas Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's father himself. So fate works in mysterious ways. Then again, it's just small community. It's not like there's 50,000, 100 million people in the country at this point. It's probably closer to 35 to 40 million maybe. Anyways, she helped him do everything, mathematics, etc., reading, writing. She was very financially capable, really helped him invest both in his own tailor shop and also into, just real estate in general. And, and the relationship really blossomed for the two of them, in which, it would be beautiful. He'd be tender, he'd be calm with her, and she'd be rambunctious and really calm herself. But, their relationship was very up and down too because of the constant distance between them, because she would stay at home, raise the family, while he would go and do political things in the future. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Just want to point that out real quickly. Over time, Andrew Johnson ultimately lived in Greenville, and around this time, it's about 1828, and Andrew Jackson's going to be president around this particular point in time. And Andrew Johnson himself really loved and valued learning. And in Greenville, there's only maybe 400 something probably people, most of them Scottish, Irish. And there is a local college, very small college, and a library with a whole bunch of different books where Andrew Johnson would always be there. He'd be frequenting that place and actually would join the debating society within the college itself and go to a whole bunch of the local universities, notably Tucson College, about 5 miles away, and would learn. He would network with a whole bunch of people and really kind of get his head around what would eventually be, the political game, the idea of the first steps into basically getting his hands and mitts into politics. And he would frequent all the places there, the colleges, the many churches there, and excuse me, like I said, meet a whole bunch of different people, learn a whole bunch of different people, read a whole bunch of different books, and be a part of just basically everything that he can get his hands on. Johnson was incredible. There's actually some books that hold some of his financial accounts where he basically was able to make a shit ton of money, relatively speaking, for a small town. If it wasn't with cash, it would be with wood or some produce. But for the most part, he was very financially lucrative, acquired some property. Basically, a lot of the local newspapers did so well that they basically said he's this artisan businessman in the petty capitalist, and really ended up buying a whole bunch of different places. He had originally rented a couple houses where the storefront was with his tailor shop. It was by 1830. He would effectively be able to employ a couple of journeyman tailors that they were able to live and board with him too, along with his growing family. 1828, that was a very big year for Andrew Johnson. He actually ends up winning a seat as the alderman for Greenville, one of the many seats that he would serve and one of the many political positions he would lead in Greenville, as he becomes this incredibly prominent individual within Greenville. He would serve in that position for a couple years, and then right after that would actually end up becoming the mayor of Greenville for a couple years as well, and really was a part of the whole identity of Andrew Jackson, the Jacksonian Democrats, for the most part. And he benefited with his basically rise in political power as a working class man, and became one of the hallmark individuals to go to. Basically, once became mayor, it's like, oh man, a lot of people really want to come to see the mayor and work in the business of the mayor itself, and the family would just keep having babies, popping them out, and Johnson's really just working hard. He's gathering much more of an education, and more so about political theories, politics, basically some of the founding fathers and a lot of their work, and ultimately is going to, I guess you could say, prepare him for a very bright and very fascinating future in the next couple of years. Being the mayor, being the alderman of the town, and espousing, and people liked him. He was a people's man. He worked for the people, by the people, etc., etc. The idea of, the Jacksonian Democrat, identifying with effectively what most of the town was, the town's laboring class. And because you have to understand, a lot of people who were in higher positions of power were much more aristocratic, and by all accounts, and everyone believed, and which is true, Andrew Johnson was a common man. He was a people's people, and a lot of people ended up liking Andrew Johnson. And, for him, he ended up becoming really popular, and he found that he actually had oratory capabilities when he was doing his debate society stuff. I mean, before that, obviously, but for the most part, he was really honing his abilities to really debate and give public speeches, and et cetera, et cetera. And, from that point on, seeing a whole bunch of other politicians, seeing a whole bunch of other people, seeing the likes of, Henry Clay in office, and Andrew Jackson as the president, and basically understanding the machinations of what it takes to be a politician, Andrew Johnson's really seeing what it's going to take, and he's really honing in the specific things that he thinks are going to be really taking him quite far and large. And ultimately, too, especially in Tennessee, where there's a very strong contingent of the Democratic Party, especially since, it's the state of Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk and a whole bunch of other presidents that are going to be coming from there. Andrew Johnson's kind of just like riding the train of the Democratic Party and the Democratic position for the most part, and a lot of people are kind of eyeing the young alderman / mayor from Greenville, all around the state itself, and a lot of people are kind of just keeping an eye on him as a very prominent person, as he's kind of making much more of a name of himself within his community too. He's a fascinating tailor. Good man, good husband, hardworking, and a very strong businessman who's basically self-made in every way, sense of, et cetera, et cetera. But that being said, things were always up and down for the most part. Like I said, Johnson's a rough and tumble man. At one point, he was charged with assault and battery on this guy. His name's Thomas McClay. They don't know what really started it, for the most part, but it's not a good sign when your mayor has to pay $100 fee for basically assaulting someone. His rise to political fame, though, wasn't going to be stopped by fighting for the most part. For Andrew Johnson, it actually started quite early, to be quite honest. I'm skipping all over the place because there's an amalgamation of information I'm trying to get straight for the most part with Andrew Johnson, but it really starts in 1831. You see, there was a slave rebellion that will be known as the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion, in which case there had to be a bit of a reconfiguration of Tennessee's state's constitution. They had to pass a new constitution with provisions, let me put it to you this way, to disenfranchise people of color, let's be quite honest about it, and also, reform state taxes, etc., etc., improvements on Tennessee's infrastructure to bring it in within the 19th century and eventual 20th century, and they brought people from all different parts and all different counties, and Andrew Johnson himself was a part of the Greene County, and he basically spoke for the adoption of this constitution. And a lot of people were like, damn, who is this guy? Who is this motherfucker? You know what I'm saying? And basically everyone in Tennessee is like, damn, boo, how you doing? Basically in Tennessee, he got a lot of statewide exposure because of this. And with this, he was able to jump into a whole bunch of different things. He would end up becoming a part of the Tennessee militia, attaining the rank of colonel. It's complicated though. He was fined for a whole bunch of different reasons. He also got a I guess like he got an opportunity to be a board of a trustee for one of the local colleges too, which for him, actually never being technically educated at all, was really big for him personally. He's like, damn, I'm moving up in the world. Anyways, 1834, 1835, there was a potential seat opened up within the actual Tennessee State Assembly, and for him, he was, obviously the Whigs and Democrats are fighting within the state of Tennessee and a whole bunch of other states, effectively, and for Andrew Johnson, he has an opportunity for the Greene County seat, which was, it's complicated back then. Seats were not distributed evenly because, one person representing a specific county, depends how many people. And for him, Greene County shared a seat with the local Washington County that was very close by. So one person for two counties, it is what it is. But anyways, in order to figure things out, there'd be local debates held between his opponents and him, in which case, just to be quick about it, he was incredible. He destroyed him, basically, and won the election by, like, at least 2-1 to 2.5-1 margins in terms of votes for his state legislative seats. Anyways, Andrew Johnson is going to be part of the Tennessee State Legislature in 1835. And when he was elected, it's fascinating, despite him loving Jackson and all that stuff. He voted, I would say, probably more so as an independent more than anything else, and probably more as a Whig, because he, argued, or more of a Democrat, although he technically was independent, as he argued against measures that would increase government spending, which was apparently very contrary to a whole bunch of different views of his constituents. He opposed the extension of railroads, etc., etc., and just little things like that, because, Democrats, were basically states' rights people. But once they went to the states, he's basically just like, hey, let's fucking just spend like crazy. And Andrew Johnson's like, no, I am ardently against excessive spending. You know, a lot of things like that, which, you know, made him a hardcore, technically principled Democrat, but not really a Jacksonian Democrat, you know, by that virtue, I guess. You know, it's kind of fascinating, his time as a state legislature. You know, as an independent, with clear party lines drawn between Democrats and Whigs, it became abundantly clear that, you know, sides were going to be chosen. Sides had to be chosen. And for Andrew Johnson, it became a bit of a problem, unfortunately for him. And despite a lot of the things that he ultimately ended up pushing, he was very much against the East Railroad Company, who was trying to get a whole bunch of different discounts, etc., etc. Big business, didn't like corporations coming and taking it in. You know, he's pretty standard, pretty objectionable states' rights Democrat, but he didn't really become a Democrat and didn't want to play party lines. He actually voted for most things that his constituents and his actual people that he's representing wanted, which, you know, endeared him to a whole bunch of different people, but not to the people who were basically like, you gotta vote party lines, okay? If you're not with us, then you're with the Democrats. The Democrats are like, well, you're not voting for any of what Andrew Jackson wants, so you're clearly not a Democrat. So basically, after, you know, doing a whole, I think he would end up voting upon 200 bills, most of them for, you know, pros on education for obviously reasons. Andrew Johnson basically kind of came back home and around 1830s. He went back and forth between Greenville and Nashville, but the last special session that he'd be a part of, he didn't know whether or not he actually even wanted to do this anymore, because he's like, I don't want to have to choose between party lines. I want to just do my own thing, and ultimately ends up saying, I just need a break from it. So he ends up throwing in the towel and gives his vote for this guy named Hugh Lawson White, who I believe was running for president against Martin Van Buren around this particular... No, never mind. Sorry, I'm getting my notes mixed up. Sorry. He basically gave up while voting for Hugh Lawson White, who was running for president against Martin Van Buren. And he decides he's going to leave and just go back to managing full-time, 100%, his tailoring expertise and his enterprise. And basically just, you know, with his growing family, did a whole bunch of different business deals. A little tidbit, too. You know, Andrew Johnson is a full grown man, you know, is a very young man still, mid-20s around this particular point in time. Didn't stand taller than 5'9", but he was very strong, very stout, and very capable individual. And this is around the time that he's just basically just trying to devote himself to his family, his life, and, you know, just the future hopes and dreams of a very promising political future. And once he leaves from the whole state legislature thing, he comes back, begins serving as the mayor again, although he's kind of just like, I don't know if I want to do it, because I gotta be honest with you, politics, while it being kind of crazy, kind of fun, I don't know, I might want to try to seek some form of re-election soon. But ultimately, he ends up coming back to the mayorship with basically seeking an opportunity in a couple years to run for the state legislature yet again. 1838, he decides he's going to run yet again for the Tennessee State House Legislature. When he was thinking about running again for 1837. Sorry about the previous part. I found it in my notes where I wrote it down, but he was displaced in a lot of ways. They basically ran a hardcore campaign against Andrew Johnson and basically told him to not run. And this guy, Brookins Campbell, who was basically very pro-railroad, etc., ultimately ends up winning the specific election. Technically, he did run. Johnson technically did run, but he wasn't very, he was just like, if I lose, I lose. And this would actually be one of the only elections he would lose until he would become president. And to put it to you this way, once he's going back home, doing his thing, working on his tailor shop, becoming a prominent citizen and making his money, he's also making a whole bunch of different connections and a whole bunch of different things are going on, in which case he just decides, that's it. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to win my state seat. I'm going to go into the political game, and I'm going to prove everyone wrong by this particular point in time. And it's really, really fascinating. It was a mixture of like Whigs and some Democrats in particular. I don't know. Was Campbell a Democrat? I forgot if he was a Democrat or not. But either way, when the election of 1839 came around, the Panic of 1837 had set in. Tennessee had established a bunch of banks to help debtors, and Johnson had been selected to a specific committee within the state of Tennessee itself to determine the specific locations of where some of these new banks are going to be, to help, establish some camaraderie with the peoples, et cetera, that need the money the most, for the most part. And for him, he uses this opportunity to meet a whole bunch of different people and gain a whole bunch of different contacts with a whole bunch of different people, and really get himself on top. He's a very prominent individual. He's in his early 30s by this particular point in time, and Andrew Johnson ends up making really, a whole bunch of different deals with a whole bunch of different people, and ultimately ends up winning the seat and unseats Campbell, who's a Democrat, with a whole bunch of different speeches, and just outmaneuvers him in every sense of the way. And by 1839, Andrew Johnson makes the full decision to become a Jackson Democrat, announcing himself as he comes back into Nashville to basically work with the whole state legislature, et cetera, et cetera. And he actually ends up attending, eventually, the welcome committee, I guess you could say, for the new governor, the Democratic governor of James K. Polk in 1839, 1840, roughly around that particular point in time. Once he's back in the state legislature, things are much clearer and only more complicated, I think, ultimately, with Andrew Johnson. He basically was very clear that he wasn't an Andrew Jackson Democrat, even though he says he was an Andrew Jackson Democrat. He really wasn't. He was much more of a Thomas Jefferson Democratic Republican. He basically was against, in any way, shape, or form, of any national bank or even an independent treasury whatsoever, and really was basically functionally there to try and vote within the party lines to preserve the government in its original purity that some people had written about him. And for him, he felt at the very least Martin Van Buren was the guy for that, which is a big reason why he was much more of a Martin Van Buren man than Andrew Jackson man, to be quite honest with you. I think. And really attempted to support Martin Van Buren in any meaningful way, and had voted for him in the 1840 election that William Henry Harrison would effectively end up winning. Johnson is really beyond all over the place. Cause there's things that are very clear. He basically denounced a whole bunch of different proposals from the Board of Bank Commissioners, anything that had to do with the bank. But still, at the very same time, a lot of people within the Democratic, because look, let's be honest, Whigs are all over the place when it comes to specifically slavery, but for Democrats, it's much more clear and succinct that, they're pretty pro-slavery. They're at the very least, they're more of a states' rights kind of thing. So for Andrew Johnson, for him to basically kind of shock people for a whole bunch, first and foremost, he first shocked people when he didn't want to basically have prayers before every session, because for him it was basically just kind of pointless and useless, and he was labeled an atheist. And for him, he wasn't very particularly religious, at least in comparison to a lot of the other presidents, for sure. But that didn't really help him, to be quite honest with you. And then what threw people off completely was initially him in redistricting and refixing and figuring out the representations within the state, actually removing the 3/5 provisions for counting slaves. And if you don't know what that means, it's a slave is not technically a citizen or a person. They are 3/5 of a person, which is the compromise that most, the government basically came up with to kind of give people who had slaves, I'll put it to you this way: if you counted a person as a slave as a person, in terms of a population, you could have more house members within a specific state, for instance, and more house members in the federal government for that particular state, which would make things grossly imbalanced in a whole bunch of different ways. And the compromise they ended up coming up with was a slave is basically like half a person. And Andrew Johnson kind of just surprised a whole bunch of people because Democrats ultimately really banked off of that. With the whole 3/5 compromise, and he basically started freaking out a whole bunch of different people, and a lot of people were kind of surprised by that. A lot of people started naming him a bit of an abolitionist, even though he's like, I own slaves. Like at this point, I think he's gonna own. By 1840, he's gonna own 10 slaves, but I think around 1838 or 35 for sure. I think he had his first slave by then, and who was a house slave specifically, and it made people confused for Andrew Johnson, which makes Andrew Johnson, like I said before, a complicated individual when it comes to slavery. I think he just looked at things in a very calculated way a lot of the time. It's not like I think he just saw people sometimes that he didn't really specifically care about one way or the other, more as like chess pieces in some ways, especially in these early goings, like a lot of people did back then, unfortunately. But no one knew where his loyalties lied, I think, is where things really stand in his early goings coming back within the state legislature. Despite the ambiguity, even within his own Democratic Party, the Democratic Party, while being wary of him, also realized he's pretty fucking good. He's pretty good at, getting people within the actual political game and really just people into politics in general. Like, first and foremost, he effectively, within a year, built one of the most succinct and clearly Democrat strongholds within Greenville County. It's actually fascinating. He built up a whole bunch of different supporters. He'd come back from Nashville and basically just send just a couple people out, some messengers, to be like, hey, Andrew Johnson's going to do this whole public speaking tour, etc., and you should be here from 10 to 11, and a whole bunch of different people will come up and see him as Andrew Johnson came in, like, who the fuck is this guy, from, all parts of his specific county and some counties adjacent to Greenville. And basically, a lot of people are like, who the fuck is this guy, etc., and, excuse me, and they had heard some things, and there's some flyers that are basically saying that he believes in Andrew Jackson's policies, the struggle against the National Bank. The Whigs are horrible, and a lot of people understand at this time because the Whigs had just won the presidential election, and I think they had one of the houses in the Congress. A lot of people were apprehensive at the Democratic message too, especially with the downfall of Martin Van Buren's presidency. And, once Andrew Johnson started speaking, there was no hurried speaking, no hesitation, no dragging, no effort after words. He was very forceful, powerful, eloquent. He might have been truly one of the greatest orators of his time. Abraham Lincoln had this ability to speak and tell stories and really wove something that kept people interested. But Andrew Johnson was just basically something else entirely. It was passion. I imagine whenever he spoke, it's like a football coach just basically going, let's fucking do this, but like as if a football coach was giving the most incredible speech of all time. Like, the halls of Congress would basically be up and roar if he had the opportunity to be president, which he would, but, in a clearly different political atmosphere for the most part. Ultimately, Andrew Johnson was basically always the main speaker, always did all the stuff whenever he would go around touring and stuff, and basically whatever he went his constituents and people would effectively go. And in 1840, the Democratic State Convention in Nashville, they appointed him specifically as one of the two presidential electors, at large for the states. And that also gave him much more of an opportunity for him specifically to campaign throughout Tennessee to become better known in other parts of the state. And then again, it'd be very difficult on the wife for the most part, that he's always constantly gone. But, at times, she was always very supportive of it. And for him, his political career would only rise and rise and rise. And, by, 1841, he effectively, first off, by later that year, he's basically attending speeches and meetings in front of 1,500 to 2,000 people. And, by 1841, he's one of the most well-known politicians within the state of Tennessee itself. For Andrew Johnson, things were just incredible, awesome, Gucci. People would love his speeches. He'd be the United States Senator, or United States State Senator for specifically, Tennessee. In 1841, and effectively ended up becoming a very prominent person within it as well, because he himself was a prominent person. He actually gave up tailoring to focus on politics and learning everything full time. He sold his business. He owned the place where the business was, but he sold the business itself, and then effectively just focused on real estate, making money off of it as a landowner and a prominent individual with the help of his wife. Not to mention too, just the appearance of Andrew Johnson, well-to-do man. His family had moved into a nice farm plantation and a bunch of slaves, always well-dressed and always someone that, he himself was no longer poor, and effectively, became the man that he always really dreamt of himself being when he first saw those rich aristocratic people when he was a young boy. By this point in time, he's already fully achieved it, and now his dreams and aspirations were much more bigger, much more grander. It's quite fascinating because this time during the state senatorship is really more so about just a political struggle for the state senatorship. There was a couple vacant seats, and basically the Democrats and Whigs were fighting each other ultimately for state control of Tennessee in general. And when he was elected, there was these two vacancies, and they both basically agreed to split them for the most part, or just not call them until the next election for the most part to really figure things out. But most people ultimately did not agree, and Andrew Johnson was just a straight up, we're not going to fucking give up, yada yada yada, Democrats all the way, yada yada yada. Ultimately, the Whigs eventually got their way, and I think they ended up filling the two seats themselves. But for the most part, Andrew Johnson basically won more control and more, positivity and more, praise from his own party. Although this made things a little more difficult at times, because Johnson himself, despite being a full-blown strict Democrat, really was, beyond all belief and recognition, a really fascinating independent politician. At times he would defend Andrew Jackson and his administration for the banks, et cetera, and the collapse of the economic system, for the brief time in the Panic of 1837. But for him, he's very basically just a strict Democrat in every sense of the word, kind of a James K. Polkian, probably more so, really, he's basically just like Jefferson, if Jefferson was incarnated today in a lot of ways, I think. Even just his ideas on slavery, etc. It's just fascinating because, again, he's just pushing for redistricting, but not counting for the 3/5 compromise, and really diverged from the party in many ways because of the whole just slavery issue during the rising that would be that would predicate before the Civil War. Andrew Johnson, look, he doesn't like black people all that much, but at the same time, and a lot of this really was political posturing, but, it's also fair to point out that in several newspapers, they're basically labeling him an abolitionist in every sense of the word, and someone who thinks that black men are equal to the white people, and that, might as well give the colored people the vote in the eyes of Andrew Johnson, and I just think it's so fascinating to really, really look at Andrew Johnson and look at him in that, particular way. But anyways, things were only progressing for Andrew Johnson. He's starting to gain a lot more fame, a lot more positive. Here's the thing for Andrew Johnson. Regardless of the negative publication and publicity, for him, any publicity is good publicity. And it kind of makes things, at the very least, interesting, because a lot of people don't see him as this abolitionist person. They just see him as an independent individual that, despite party lines, etc., he's just not going to be tied to one specific party line. So he's going to get an opportunity in national politics, very soon. 1843 was a very fascinating year for Andrew Johnson and for the Democrats in general. I believe James K. Polk would lose his re-election bid for the governorship, but, seeing as a natural progression for rising politicians such as Andrew Johnson himself, Andrew Johnson ultimately decides he's going to try his hand at national politics and run for the House of Representatives. Everything kind of worked in his favor. The redistricting really worked in his favor for the political scene. Both in the state legislature, and his political prominence allowed him to be a really strong national politician. So things were looking up for him. And it's a very political and very divisive political, I guess you could say, election in which Andrew Johnson would be fighting tooth and nail against all his opponents. And ultimately, just long story short, because I don't want this episode to be 5 hours long, Andrew Johnson would win a majority of the votes. Andrew Johnson, by 1843, is going to be a member of the House of Representatives. Once in the House of Representatives, Andrew Johnson would begin a very, very long career in national and federal politics. It's a very complicated journey for Andrew Johnson, all the way and all about. Like I said before, he did not like, and particularly think black people were in the similar vein as the white man, and voted in a bunch of ways that was always in a spirit of defense of slavery and white supremacy. But, overall, his voting record, was basically, how do I put it? There was like 4 things he was always known for, and that was, an advocacy for the rights of the poor people and laboring people, and also against any overbearing aristocracy. He was always against any sort of government spending, exceptionally in any sort of infrastructure spending, etc., etc., and also against protective tariffs, along with his slavery, white supremacy, and also free land for the landless, specifically. Those would be the main and specific things he would be known for, especially in the early goings of his political career. When he came in, a lot of people surprisingly called him what effectively would be the last Jacksonian when he first came in, for a lot of reasons. He had shared many of the ideas with what is now considered the radical left wing of the specific Democratic Republic or Democratic Party. The Democratic Party at this point is the party of James K. Polk, and James K. Polk, like I said before when I did my episode on him, was much more of the more southern, I guess you could say generalized Democrat for the most part, very states' rights advocate, and not one that's like, because like Polk and Jackson are 2 very different Democrats, and same as with Johnson and Polk. They're both aggressively and fascinatingly in various different ways, and just different perspectives, really, because the Democratic Party was slowly becoming the party of the aristocracy in a lot of ways, the southern antebellum type of people, and Savannah and all those, like rich people. And he did not come from those upbringings and beginnings, but he was functionally a part of what was institutionally and originally the initial ideas of the Jacksonian Party. So he's much more aligned with Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren than, say, James K. Polk. But still sided with, the Democrats, and ultimately supported James K. Polk in his presidency in 1844. But during his particular time in office, he advocated for several different things. The first thing that he would always push for aggressively would be the Homestead Act, which was basically, in its simplest terms, the law that helped poor Americans and immigrants in particular to help them get new land. They had to go westward, obviously, but if you were at least 21 years old and you're on the land for 5 years, then you can have it, or at least, I don't know how many acres specifically. It would always work back and forth, but for the most part, 160 acres per parcel. It just depends on the individual and the particular time, politics, and just depends on how people worked it, I guess. And it's all variations, and I'm going all over the place. But for the most part, Andrew Johnson was vehemently for this. Worked hard, got enough votes within the House of Representatives to pass it, but it did not pass in the Senate. And it wouldn't be passed until 1862 when Abraham Lincoln gets it done with the Republican Congress. It's a lot of these things, because a lot of these things would be more Whig and Republican ideals than actual Democrat ideals. So he always voted for really what he believed that was right, regardless. He still voted for the Democrats in a lot of things, notably slavery, the gag rule, all those, Democrat things against John Quincy Adams, all those people, and, basically a part of the old school Democratic ideals and the Democratic Republican ideals of limited government. Basically just was full bore against it. He did not like the Smithsonian, voted against a whole bunch of different things that would help give them money and appropriations. I also didn't like West Point. I thought that was really interesting. He because he did not want to raise the soldiers' pay, and basically ridiculed West Point officers, decreed taxes on tea and coffee as being offensive to the poor, and for the most part was effectively just, we are not spending any money. This is pointless. Let's not do this. This is not how this government should be or would be. And he basically just was 100% full bore into that. And that's just basically covering the first, I would say, 3 or 4 years of his time in the House of Representatives, when he's in between the end of Tyler's presidency, when he first gets into effectively what will be Polk's presidency. And all this time, he's financially just been a boss. His family weathered the Panic of 1837 better than anybody, and he's set up for incredible levels of future success. People had different opinions on Johnson, though, in fairness, despite all the successes that he had, including President Polk. Polk always felt very fascinated by him. He always thought Andrew Johnson was a very vindictive person, perverse in his temper and conduct, even though he felt like he didn't give him any offense. He always had a fiery temper, fiery anger and frustration, probably from, his youth and feeling like he had been used, a lot of frustrations from feeling like he always had to fight for everything that he had. And a lot of people, for better or worse, some really just didn't like him because of that, and then others really just didn't like him for political reasons, would always call him filthy, slimy, etc., etc. And in fairness, Andrew Johnson is a very fascinating human being, and he has a personality and temperament that does not like and go well with a lot of people. I don't know if I would call him specifically, I don't want to say he's corrupt. He's not. I don't think he's corrupt. In fact, he's probably one of the few that ultimately, at the very least on the onset, tries to do things by the book and follows his principles. But at the same time, he's also a very specifically smart and politically active and motivated individual. That being said, though, he made some friends. Notably, some of his colleagues would be his future vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, a very complex politician, and also become pretty fascinated with a whole bunch of different people. ex-president John Quincy Adams, and a whole bunch of actually other Whigs would basically he would meet and actually have a pretty strong correspondence with, even though he didn't like the politics of several people. But for him, he had actually just him and all these other House representatives is really fascinating, and the relationships they would have with all of them had varying different degrees. Everyone was bipolar when it came to just their opinion of Johnson. A whole bunch of different people liked him, a whole bunch of different people didn't like him. He was friends with everyone and also enemies with everyone, and things just started becoming very fascinating overall. That's just the only way I could probably and really just functionally put it. But for the most part, like I said, he was just someone that raged against the aristocracy and the aristocratic class, regardless of your political affiliation. He always raged against the interests, I guess you could say, of Tennessee's planter class, and really wanted to help the poor people come up, not just in Tennessee, but a whole bunch of different states. And he basically just did this for so long, for so many years, and ultimately just continued to vote along those specific fundamental principles, while also voting alongside certain democratic policies. By 1848, he's effectively voting in favor of the railroad companies, the same railroad issues that had actually lost him or pushed him out of the political office in 1837. So he's doing this for some time, for a lot of years. The relationship with his wife, it's much better now. They figured out kind of like how they're going to make it work. She's not in Washington. She would stay at home while Johnson would try and come back and forth as much as he possibly could. But like I said, Andrew Johnson is going to be a congressman during one of the most heated political issues and in political times within this country's history. Once Polk gets all the land, because slavery is already a contentious issue, but when Polk gets that such large accumulation of land from Texas, the Oregon Territory, etc., debate starts swirling about land going into the new territory. He opposes vehemently the Wilmot Proviso, and he's just like, dude, what are you doing? You're a Democrat, and effectively ends up voting in favor of the Compromise of 1850. This is where things start becoming more formed for Andrew Johnson, I think. Because above all else, he's a fundamental believer within this country's constitution and this country's belief within the Constitution. He's always a very pro-union person, and this would be very aggressively so. What he ultimately will support is the pro-union ideal of the Compromise of 1850. He would say himself that the preservation of the Union ought to be the subject, which is paramount to all other considerations. I think it was also, too, he voted in favor of the Fugitive Slave Act, little things like that. I should also point out, too, that it's around this time that understand too, with all other politicians and how politics really works and affects other people, it's just like it's difficult. States start changing, people start changing, things start changing. It's not like California was blue overnight, but it starts going into a particular direction. For Tennessee, Whigs started winning, and Whigs started dominating the national politics and the national scene by the election of Zachary Taylor. I think they end up taking back one of the houses by that point in time. And Tennessee was looking like it's going to lose its Democratic majority. Tennessee is going to be one of the fascinating border states that's going to be a part of the Civil War. And it's kind of like a weird internal struggle that's going on there. And Andrew Johnson's going to be, kind of a fixture in it. So with some land redistricting, etc., and a whole bunch of different things occurring, I guess you could say, around this particular point in time, Andrew Johnson decides he's probably at this point not going to win his re-election bid for the U.S. House of Representatives after being in the House for about the better part of a decade by this point. By 1852, the Democratic Party is kind of just all over the place, to be quite honest with you. They're trying to find compromise candidates. Pierce is going to be the guy that's going to end up coming up. And, it affects everyone very differently. This turmoil within the party, and the Whigs kind of falling all over themselves. So Andrew Johnson, unfortunately, would not run again in 1852, with the Tennessee legislature now fully in grasp of the Whig-controlled state legislature. That being said, something's going to be coming up, and just so happens that in Tennessee, the governorship is open. Da-da-da. So 1852, Andrew Johnson would go against a man named Gustavus Henry. He was basically the Whig prominent leader within the Tennessee legislature, and I believe he was the two-time governor at this point. At this point, Andrew Johnson, by all accounts, is going to be the Tennessee Democratic Party leader in a lot of ways. A lot of people in his party were not happy about his nomination, but they felt that he was probably going to be the individual who was going to probably beat him. And it's a little bit kind of just like, let's see what's going to happen, because Andrew Johnson would lose his seat in the House of Representatives because of the redistricting of Gustav Henry. They actually called it Henry Mandering, as it's just fascinating. Anyways, the two, it was pretty politically biased, and the two would actually, under Andrew Johnson's belief, let's just hold a couple of debates. And Gustav Henry's like, oh, I'm going to be cocky, and I'm going to try and beat this fool into submission. Anyways, they held a series of debates throughout the states, and to put it this way, the debates did not go well for Gustav Henry. Gustav Henry would lose, not overwhelmingly, but for the most part, after lengthy debates, and a couple of them were called off because of Henry had some family problems, Johnson would win his election by more than at least 2,000 votes. And basically, Henry's support did not show up. People respected Andrew Johnson and Andrew Johnson's ability as a person who had a functional belief in as little intervention as much as possible, states' rights, and really supporting the working man. Once elected, he wanted to set examples. He actually followed Jefferson's example, and instead of taking the carriage to his inauguration, he walked. I guess, I don't know, it's something very interesting and fascinating. His speech was really, by his own standards, pretty porous, ironically, for his inauguration. But for the most part, despite not having a lot of power at all, the governorships never really had a lot of power, and especially Tennessee governorships did not have a lot of power. Johnson proposed some legislation, but not veto a whole bunch of different things, and the Whigs had really controlled the legislature. That being said, he understood, unlike a lot of his former Democratic political allies and Democratic governors before him, that he was able to do two things. One, he was able to publicize himself, his political views, etc., and really get himself out there on the national scene. But also, number two, he was actually able to appoint different people to various state positions, and also basically push his agenda within the actual legislation above all else. First and foremost, that he was able to do was really push for legislation to improve schools. One of the very few taxes he really was for was to levy basically like a little state tax for something, in order to actually make necessary changes to help improve public schools, offices, Bates measures, whatever you want to call it, in which they would effectively end up getting passed. So he ended up being able to put in a whole bunch of different people in a whole bunch of different positions. He actually played both sides of the political coin, surprisingly. He helped get a whole bunch of different appointments and basically got some Whigs kind of in his back pocket. So when people say he was kind of a politically, slimy individual, I don't blame them, but I just think he's just politically smart, if I'm going to be quite honest with you. He got John Bell, a Whig, one of the state's U.S. Senate seats, and effectively ended up getting a whole bunch of different things passed and pushed, in his view, within the actual Tennessee state legislature. along with the Whigs' decline within national politics and federal politics. The Whig Party was basically decline as well in a whole bunch of different states. Tennessee, ironically, it remained pretty strong there. So strong, in fact, that when he was trying to go for his re-election bid, it became a little bit difficult, unfortunately, for Andrew Johnson. Johnson's re-election campaign would go against this guy, Meredith Gentry, and who was technically a Whig, but he was technically part of the Know Nothing Party, or at least really pushed for the Know Nothing Party. And basically, he was on decline, specifically as, unfortunately, Franklin Pierce's presidency really fucked over a bunch of different people, and ultimately, just the Democrats in general. This is at the time that, the Kansas and Nebraska Act is coming, which he's in favor for. He was always what they would consider a slaveocracy, and basically just voted along the lines, or proposed and agreed along the lines of, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas and Nebraska Act from Stephen Douglas, the annexation of Texas and Oregon, which, by the way, not a lot of Southerners really wanted Oregon for whatever reason, the Oregon Territory. I think it was mainly because of slavery, and, just more territory in the North meant less slave territory and more power for the North in a lot of ways. But for him, he was just like more land in general is great for poor people. He was a poor person advocate. And the election itself was very contested. So there was real possibility that he was going to lose. But he took some strong positions, I guess you could say. For him, he was basically just like, let people be people. And Gentry just kind of shot himself in the foot. As Andrew Johnson himself is basically like, look, man, we're all people, we're all immigrants. First Amendment protects all this shit, yada yada yada. Anyways, he wins his re-election campaign and re-election bid and starts proposing a couple of interesting ideas. First and foremost, in 1855 to 1856, when he runs his re-election bid, he really starts doing a couple things. First off, he really pushes for closing down all the banks, which I think he does to an extent, and no currency or any amount less than $5 is allowed to really pay for any goods or services. Sorry, it has to be anything less than $5 to pay for goods and services. Sorry, and just little things like that. Just really pushing for, aggressively so, the unskilled labor and poor people, and helping prop them up as much as he humanly can. And a lot of things are happening. James Buchanan will become president. There's actually a bit of a push for Andrew Johnson to become president, although he realizes it's probably not going to be him, and he doesn't like Buchanan, but he still pushes for him, and still, I guess you could say, roots for him and campaigns for him. But Andrew Johnson has his eyes on another prize, and the biggest reason why he wanted to win a second term of the governorship was to get an opportunity to work and eye an election towards the United States Senate. So, 1857, Andrew Johnson decides he's going to try and run for the United States Senate. Senators are still elected by the state legislatures, and he, with a whole bunch of the, I guess you could say, political maneuvering, not to mention Democrats were working hard over the next couple years to regain the majority within the state legislature of Tennessee. Andrew Johnson effectively will win an election bid to become the state senator for Tennessee in 1857. So he ends up going to the Senate. He goes to Washington. His train gets derailed, and then he basically fucks up his right arm. And it's really fascinating. He really messes up his right arm. It's going to cause him problems, and I'll talk probably more about it in later parts for the most part. But he hurts his right arm. It's going to cause him problems for quite a long time. But now he's a senator, so that's great. Yay. So very briefly for Andrew Johnson, his time as a senator is just him doing basically three things. One, getting a lot more political power, more political sway. Number two, trying to keep the Democrats in a lot of ways together. The North and the South are going to be fighting each other left and right. It's not a very conducive situation.
as James Buchanan is breaking up the party and this country single-handedly with a lot of the things that he's espousing, for better or worse, and not dealing with the Southern rebels that are destroying the Union, which Andrew Johnson vehemently does not like. Just real quick, Andrew Johnson is basically against secessionists in general. I think he just hates the entire. I think he just hates the entire planter elite society, which is kind of the truth, in fairness to Andrew Johnson, which he's kind of right about. And what I mean is that, a lot of the Southerners, the ones that actually had slaves, the rich people, the Southern aristocrats, etc., he does not like, ultimately protecting slavery and convincing a whole bunch of poor Southern youths to fight in the war in their stead, he's not for. That's basically the perspective of Andrew Johnson, and he sees this happening, and above all else, that any form of secession from the Union is borderline treason. But the one thing he loves, one thing he pushes for aggressively so, is this push for his Homestead Act. This time, after a year of political maneuvering, etc., he's able to get it passed through both houses of Congress, only for it to get shot down by James Buchanan. So he is effectively against James Buchanan now in every sense of the word. And basically just around this particular time, it's just political validity, as volatileness, as I guess you could say, that is just happening. And for Andrew Johnson, things are just getting more fascinating, more interesting. He's basically working on trying to get the Homestead Act refigured and basically just fixed, that it actually passes through the House legislature in all forms of legislation. And while this is happening, it's going to be late 1859, 1860, when a presidential election's coming up. There's a lot of people that are fighting for Andrew Johnson to become the specific representative. A lot of people thought, he's going to be much better as a compromise candidate between everybody, beyond all belief of recognition between Stephen Douglas, John C. Breckinridge, yada, yada. And he felt that he himself, being basically a Southern slave-owning, aristocratic individual in his own eyes, but someone who adamantly, functionally fights for the actual working-class people, and is someone that is very pro-union, I think he in his eyes thought he was a potential presidential candidate. And like I said, the election of 1860, just the nominating processes itself, are very incredible. And ultimately, Abraham Lincoln's going to win the presidency, and Andrew Johnson is going to have a very difficult decision to make. Johnson in Congress, once Abraham Lincoln became president and all the southern states started seceding left and right, he basically made a decision, spoke to the Senate on the topic of secession. And although he believed the southern states had the right to continue slavery, he felt that functionally they did not have the right to leave the Union. He would say, "It is treason, nothing but treason, and if one state upon its own volition can go out of this confederacy without regard to the effect it has upon the remaining parties to the compact, what is your government worth?" He would always say that he warned a lot of the people, including his own people in Tennessee, that it would just dissolve into anarchy, patchwork little petty governments, and above all else that the republic is here for a reason. And for the most part, everyone was stunned by Andrew Johnson, even because a lot of people thought he took stances, but they didn't think it was like, oh my god, But this was like, oh, you actually believe in the shit that you're espousing. Okay, interesting. And for Andrew Johnson, other people, he basically split the United States just with a lot of his ideas, I guess you could say. The new Republican Party loved him. The old Southern Democrats basically burned him in effigy. In Tennessee, it was beyond mixed. Tennessee is one of the most fascinating states within the Union. I mean, the election of 1860, they don't vote Republican or Democrat. They vote John Bell, I believe. And, it's just fascinating because they're all over the place ideologically and politically. And they're one of these border states that's going to be very important to Abraham Lincoln. Before I get into that, basically during the first
couple of weeks of Abraham Lincoln's presidency, he's basically just being put through the ringer left and right, and basically just reiterating his belief above all else that I'm not an abolitionist, but if it means that the Union's going to be dissolved because of this, then fuck it, we'll free all the slaves, do all. He's basically just like being woke and just like it's fascinating in my personal view. But he basically just says that like if you're leaving the Union, you're no more honorable than anyone who fucking is basically a fake person, someone who's an abolitionist but not really an abolitionist. It's like you're just a fake person. You don't really believe in the country and the ideas espoused in this country, otherwise you would fight for it, Do it through the government and legislation. Don't bitch and cry and play this victim mentality, And that's basically what his stance is. And Abraham Lincoln's like, I see you, boo. I see you. During the beginning parts of this Civil War that's going to occur, Andrew Johnson's idea and plan that he needed to do was keep Tennessee, one of the border states, a part of the Union. Like I said before he came back, he had warned his constituents that the dissolution of the United States would result in basically anarchy. And Tennessee basically was all over the place. It was very split. Eastern Tennessee was pretty pro-Union, but the southern parts of it were very sectionalist and secessionist by nature. Johnson worried in every sense of the word about his state and above all else his family. So once Fort Sumner was attacked, Johnson returned home. He tried to come back home and talk some sense into his fellow citizens. Along the way, during a specific couple of train rides, his trains were raided by Confederates who threatened to lynch the senator. He'd been attacked by mobs at various stops, and basically they're trying to search for him. And he's just like, I'm not Andrew Johnson. I'm trying to get back home. But, he basically somehow managed to escape basically getting lynched. Getting to a point where he had to defend himself with a pistol, which... He's a fucking Wild Times fan, you know what I'm saying? Anyways, Andrew Johnson, pistol in hand, Second Amendment, whoop whoop. He comes home. He comes home safely. And his family's like, what the fuck is happening? And he's like, don't you know it's all out Civil War? Like, you should probably move. And she's like, I'm not moving. I'm not going anywhere. And like, damn it. Eliza's like, God damn it. Okay. And he ends up... going into Nashville. It goes into a whole bunch of different parts of the country and does a whole bunch of different speeches, goes to a whole bunch of different conventions, and above all else just starts saying we need to remain in the Union. And for Tennessee, a whole bunch of these states hold a bunch of conventions, hold a convention whether they're going to succeed or not, and ultimately they vote on it. And Tennessee had their own convention in the middle of 1861. A convention was held and Tennessee voted to secede from the Union. The eastern portion of Tennessee would remain loyal and would specifically remain loyal to the Union and Andrew Johnson. So when Andrew Johnson basically is like, okay, I can at least say something to Abraham, and this is what's just gonna have to work. So he goes home, goes back home first, make sure his family's well, and then returns to Washington, and basically is leaving Tennessee to go back to Washington with effectively as armed of an escort party that you could possibly have. As he reached the capital safely, though, he had a whole bunch of different reports that the Confederates were harassing Unionists in eastern Tennessee. He had feared for his family, his friends, etc., and he really urged a whole bunch of different Union leaders and Abraham Lincoln himself, hey, can you send, some people there to help protect my family? But in fairness, Abraham Lincoln's dealing with a war, and a whole bunch of different people are dealing with the conflict itself, and Tennessee would kind of fall into disarray. So Andrew Johnson's like, well, we're going to have to fucking do it ourselves then. For basically the better part of a couple months, it was a little bit chaotic down there. Johnson's Union class, I guess you could say, fought against the slave-holding, aristocratic individuals within Tennessee. You have to understand the level of hatred, power, and aggressiveness Andrew Johnson felt during this time. He is the only Southern senator not to resign his seat within the United States Senate. The only one. and adamantly supported Abraham Lincoln, and objected to any compromise with the Confederacy as long as the rebels were in charge, And in Tennessee, Johnson's pro-Union Tennessee people were basically just the non-slave holding, I think they're called yeoman farmers, against elite planters, and the cultural differences between, the mountain country folk with the rich, low, the mountain country folk of low country plantations against the, big, I guess you could say, powerful planter elites, I mean, in the South, Andrew Johnson is a traitor. A whole bunch of effigies were hung in his own hometown. Some of his properties were confiscated, and his wife and daughters and sons were basically driven from the state with whatever they possibly could carry on wagon. And in the North, Johnson's basically a hero, so it's kind of fascinating. And Johnson and his family would have to relocate outside of Tennessee just for the time being. I forgot where specifically in my outline notes, but basically his entire family, for the time being, were basically displaced. That being said, military intervention would arrive soon in Tennessee. A lot of troops would begin winning victories in Tennessee. President Lincoln actually appointed Andrew Johnson the military governor of the state, gave him the rank of brigadier general. Really just gave him full power to discharge executive, legislative, and a whole bunch of judicial functions. I mean, Johnson ruled with a very heavy hand. So basically Nashville and Tennessee are basically there. It was basically him. I think Fremont was in Kentucky. There's a whole bunch of different states that are in contention at that point. It's very complicated. Regardless, though, of the contention, I mean, Andrew Johnson ruled with an iron fist in every single way. He arrested a whole bunch of different critics. They're very, very rich Southern secessionists, and putting them in prison. And effectively, any critics against the federal government held them without trials. That included clergymen, or specifically clergymen who supported the Confederacy in their sermons, which is really fascinating. He dismissed a whole bunch of different people who were unwilling to denounce secession whatsoever, closed anti-union newspapers, seized all railroads. I mean, I'm talking about full-blown military dictatorship, authoritarian. And it's around this time, too, that the Confederacy was kind of targeting Tennessee in a lot of ways. There'd be a couple Confederate raids and parties, and they would actually he would actually petition the president to give him some more supplies for war. But basically, it wasn't all for naught, and the rebels were really threatening. And then Andrew Johnson, in fairness, I think he's a ballsy dude, big ball, basically said that to the Confederates, if you're going to try and take Nashville, you're going to try and take Tennessee, he made it very clear that if you're going to basically try and get me to surrender, you're just going to have to basically find my remains under a burned out Capitol, because I would rather set fire to it than surrender. Ballsy. Anyways, nothing really happened from there. Most of the tension would go from east and west of Tennessee, the Potomac, and then the General Grant and his men in Vicksburg and all that stuff. But for the most part, his time as the military governor really was to punish the Confederate elite, rob them of a whole bunch of different resources, which you could say is a bit of a punishing thing, but I also argue too strategic as well. Less rich Southern Confederates, the better for the most part, and it also made things a little bit difficult for Andrew Johnson. The Emancipation Proclamation is going to be coming up soon, obviously. But for the most part, Lincoln was really pushing Johnson to start Reconstruction early in Tennessee, and the idea of Reconstruction early on in Tennessee, and ultimately ended up urging him around 1862, 1863 to push the emancipation of slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st of 1863, all of northern territories, and Tennessee, like I said, isn't a very complicated state. They would have slavery, but not abolish it, not at least until 1864. Johnson himself
basically fought hard and exempted Tennessee from the Emancipation Proclamation, and for a lot of reasons, because of his own slavery issues, but also for the other reason too, that he still wanted Tennessee, which is basically in the midst of its own internal civil war, to try and figure out, hey, what the fuck are we gonna do? For the most part, ultimately, Johnson's trying to get a whole bunch of different people on board, because he's trying to do this, I think, fairly in a way that's going to be very conducive for a whole bunch of people, while still protecting the institution of slavery itself. He's not an abolitionist. He's actually still trying to protect slavery in a lot of ways, and not trying to force it upon Tennessee itself. But even he himself, after a couple months, comes to the own conclusion that specifically, he's basically just like, God damn it, I'm gonna have to free slaves, aren't I? So he basically just agrees and accepts it for what it is. Ultimately ends up freeing his own slaves, trying to set the example first, and helps his slaves in a whole bunch of different ways too. And ultimately ends up pushing for Tennessee to end slavery the following year. And also, if I might want to add as well, the Union needed military help and support. So in Tennessee, there's actually, I guess, a large contingent of a black population in Tennessee, in which, let me put it to you this way, he went all over the place, and a lot of things that he did, ultimately as the governor of Tennessee, split Tennessee up, and took a lot longer for Tennessee to be considered a free state specifically. He failed in a lot of aspects of his job as the territorial governor. Let's just be quite honest with you. He was an authoritarian, and that's not good. But the very same end of the spectrum, he's effectively seen in a lot of eyes as like what the South should be in a lot of ways. And I think that's when, 1864, and a re-election bid is coming up, things are becoming very interesting, and things are becoming very very positive for Andrew Johnson. He would effectively end up getting quite a few African American men to support the war and to support the Union itself, fighting within the Union, and getting a lot of people back that were former Southern secessionists back into the Union, with the whole Union loyalty oath thing that Lincoln basically just said all you need to do was just pledge an oath to the Union. Although Johnson enforced his own, which pissed off a lot of people, but, that's just Johnson. The Republicans really fought hard to try and get Democrats back on board. There was a whole bunch of war Democrats in the North that didn't really secede from the Union, per se, but were not Republicans by any stretch of the imagination. And to put it pointedly, Andrew Johnson was the man by every sense of the word. He was the individual that basically was going to always be the vice president in a lot of ways. Hannibal Hamlin, who was the Lincoln's running mate and vice president, actually, and friend of Andrew Johnson, he was healthy, but it was just more about unity. In fact, the Republicans actually ran under the banner of the National Union Party. Ultimately, Andrew Johnson was a little bit apprehensive at first, but for the most part, he's like, that's cool. Okay, I can dig it. I can actually, do this and, campaign, and actively ended up campaigning in a whole bunch of different states, Tennessee, all over the country for Abraham Lincoln and for this, random National Union Party. But like I said, this election is really fascinating, and, excuse me, the election actually ends up going well for Abraham Lincoln. He wins, and Andrew Johnson becomes the next vice president, or vice president-elect. So, before he becomes the vice president, Andrew Johnson's got a whole bunch of different things going on. He basically really heavily hastened preparations for transferring and transforming the government of Tennessee from the military authoritarianship to a civil government, resigning a whole bunch of his different military, commissions, and basically just pushed forward, trying to reestablish civility within Tennessee, as the war is very clearly dying down. It will end very soon. They also ratified a new constitution abolishing slavery on February 22nd, 1865. That would be one of his final acts as the governor of Tennessee.
So Johnson goes to Washington to be sworn in what is probably one of the better known aspects of his career, unfortunately, is his, I guess you could say, swearing in. He had been ill. Some people said, like, Castile cited typhoid fever. And, I mean, there's no evidence, but I think it's just jitters, personally, for me. I just think he was very, it was like, ooh, I'm the vice president, what the fuck, and, I mean, things were going really fast for Andrew Johnson, so he took a couple of shots, 5 or so, of whiskey, I believe, to celebrate as well with a friend. Unfortunately, he came to the inauguration really drunk and took another couple shots and basically, to put it quite plainly, had one of the most comical inaugurations of all time, which basically put and rubbed everyone the wrong way. In fact, when he was at the podium, they actually tried to lead him away because he was blabbering on and on about random things, and he basically kisses the Bible and says, "In I kiss this book in the face of my nation of the United States." And despite all this, he ends up basically just saying, I fucked up, I need to get my shit together. So now that he's vice president, and I know I'm rushing through a lot of this, but his presidency is probably the most fascinating aspect of his life. For effectively the month and a half that he's the vice president, he goes on an all-out, I'm going to make up and not act a fool kind of tour, and he actually presents himself very honorably. He ends up becoming the head of the Senate and does basically the first couple meetings very well, and also visits a whole bunch of different cities, a whole bunch of different destroyed southern states and capitals, and goes to Abraham Lincoln himself the day before he dies, I believe, or the day he dies, basically telling Abraham Lincoln, do not be easy on these former rebels. Basically, just, don't go easy on them for the most part during what is effectively going to be the Reconstruction period in the United States. And later on that night, yes, I believe April 14th, Abraham Lincoln is shot. Johnson, he's at the hotel, I believe, in Washington, and he's awakened by a large knock on the door. And he is told that the president has been shot. He dresses quickly and goes to the house where Lincoln was dying. And the next morning, Andrew Johnson was right there when Lincoln died, I believe. And now he effectively, once Lincoln dies, is the president of the United States of America. And Andrew Johnson is going to be overseeing one of the most important periods and necessary periods in this country's history. He's sworn in the very next day, and Andrew Johnson is president number 17. Before we get into everything with Andrew Johnson, there's a couple conspiracy theories that Johnson might have been a part of it, or some things, I don't know. There's a whole bunch of random little tidbits of conspiracy. I don't know. It's very hard to hide conspiracy theories back then. And, I take everything with a grain of salt, and I don't trust everything. So I look at every little aspect and detail that I possibly can, that I get my hands on, and I will put it to you this way. It's just all coincidental that Andrew Johnson, because there was a couple people that were supposed to be killed. It was him, the Secretary of State, William Seward, who were both attacked. Seward barely survived, and Andrew Johnson's would-be assassin got drunk, I guess you could say. And even some of the assassins and people who were part of the trial basically were basically kind of just like, oh, yeah. And there's one story about John Wilkes Booth actually going to Johnson's private secretary in his office with a card and basically saying, are you home? Don't wish to disturb you, John Wilkes Booth. And, just a whole... It's just everything's all over the place, I guess you could say. So I don't know, and there's a whole bunch of different things partly too because he is a Southerner and a Democrat technically. So it could be anything, and a whole bunch of different conspiracies that go along with it. But the whole point being that we don't know, and history is And that's why it's always going to be fascinating with history, because we really just truly don't know. But regardless, John Wilkes Booth's going to be killed, and the would-be assassins are going to be tried specifically. His cabinet is interesting. He's the Democrat, and most of his cabinet is going to be basically Lincoln's cabinet, and eventually, and effectively, since basically Congress is all Republicans, all he could do is really get mostly just Republicans to end up filling a lot of those positions. So he's kind of screwed, but he trusted specifically William Seward and Edward Stanton, which were the Secretary of States and Secretary of War. Not to mention, too, a whole bunch of different other people. I'm sorry. My brain's not working right now. Basically, Stanton was going to be the guy who was going to do the Reconstruction policies and a whole bunch of different things, and he's going to be, one of the important people when it comes to the God, why can't I think of it? Impeachment issue with Andrew Johnson. William Seward, the Secretary of State, really going to have a fascinating expansionist foreign policy, and for the most part, a lot of people there really were trying to work with Johnson. But once Johnson broke with a lot of the Republicans in Congress, and things started getting aggressively divisive, a lot of them would effectively resign, notably his Attorney General, his Postmaster General, his Secretary of the Interior would retire or resign, and Johnson spends a lot of this time really trying to get a whole bunch of different people to go through as his appointment specifically to replace him within the cabinet. He would have no vice president, by the way. I just want to point that out. And a little tidbit, too, he actually tried to get Ulysses S. Grant on his as the Secretary of War to replace Stanton. But for the most part, he was just aggressively against it. So then he would try to get William Sherman. He failed and effectively ended up just agreeing on John Schofield as his replacement specifically. Johnson also, just want to point this out really quickly for his Supreme Court, appointed a couple of federal judges during his presidency, all to district courts specifically. He did not appoint anyone or a single justice to the Supreme Court. There were spots, though. John Cantron had actually died, and he nominated this guy Henry Stanberry. Who was actually his Attorney General, and also. Just want to point out with Henry Stanberry real quick, he's actually going to resign his spot within his seat, I guess you could say, in the cabinet, in order to actually defend Andrew Johnson during his impeachment trial. But ultimately, basically, Republicans were basically just like, you're not going to appoint anyone to the actual Supreme Court at all. So they effectively ended up passing the Judicial Circuits Act of 1866. You got to remember, there were 10 seats at the time, and they effectively eliminated that seat and bringing the court number of seats back down to 9, which where it is today. Where is the country at when Andrew Johnson becomes president? Well, it's in a fucking mess in every sense of the word, okay? North and South are both destroyed. The South in particular is just devastated beyond all belief and recognition. They're still trying to chase down the Confederate leaders, notably Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, a whole bunch of different people. They're trying to get everyone back in the South back into the Union to acclimate with the states with a whole bunch of different political proposals, trying to implement a whole bunch of different governors, military governors that are going to make sure that they're going to go with the Union, et cetera, et cetera. And trying to reconstruct the country in a whole bunch of different ways, trying to reestablish trade for the South and North in a whole bunch of different countries. Look, I got to be 100% honest with you. A whole bunch of different people do not like Andrew Johnson. They truly do not. And, you guys have very fair criticisms to levy upon Andrew Johnson as well for overall just his general presidency. And I do not blame you guys for, anyone who has a particular opinion on Andrew Johnson. But you're asking a man with one of the most Herculean tasks of literally repairing the country that literally borderline almost destroyed itself in every meaningful way. And that can't be forgotten, and that should not be forgotten, that you basically gave this man basically the worst job you can humanly give any human being. And it's not helped by the fact that the radical Republicans, who were on his side in the very beginning, were basically just like, oh yeah, cool, you want to really levy punishment on these guys? Fuck yeah, and basically the country's still tensely against one another. There's still anger, there's still frustration, you have to understand this, and animosity, and what we need in this country, because basically everything's all fucked up, okay? We don't know what's going to happen. Everything's all up in the air. Money-wise, economy-wise, it's destroyed. North is doing much better, but the North, to try and supplement the economy in the South while trying to expand in a meaningful way that's going to help economic prosperity and get people working and jobs and productive again, it's going to be difficult. Industries need to really be up, get back everything to the way it was. South needs to go back to farming and also produce a whole bunch of their own industrial revolution and get things working down there for them. Normalize relations, make sure that there's no remnants of any anger, Confederacy in the South. What do you do with the black people? What do you do with the slaves? They're freed, but how do you help them, especially in the South? Do you give them land? What's going to happen? There's a whole bunch of different things in the air, and this country is all up in the air. And ultimately and unfortunately, this country, within the next 20 years from this point on, is really going to shape the next, really, 100 years. So these are crucial points and crucial years and crucial moments that need to be fixed. And, the world's kind of just wondering what the United States is going to do. We're not a superpower, but we're still a very powerful, capable nation, full of industry and full of capability. And people are trying to make it all work. And what's going to happen after Andrew Johnson's presidency is going to be beyond me and what a lot of people are perceiving. And everyone's kind of just looking at Andrew Johnson like, what's going to happen? And they just don't know. And that's just where we're at in this country at this particular point in time. It's up in the air. Civil War just ended, but that doesn't mean everything's all hunky-dory. What are some of the things that will happen when Andrew Johnson becomes president? John D. Rockefeller is going to be a thing during this point in time. He's going to open up his first oil refinery around this particular point in time. The Union Pacific is going to start opening the railroads in the East specifically. 5,000 laborers building railroads. That's going to just basically spread all out throughout the entire country. The 10-gallon hat's going to be a thing, so that's going to be brilliant and beautiful. To certain individuals and certain people, they're probably not going to like it, but Francis Galton introduces eugenics, so that's a thing. Gregory Mendel explains heredity. Little tidbits like that, for the most part, I think are really interesting. India and Britain are finally going to be linked by telegraph, as economic depressions hit South Africa, and the world's in a very fascinating place as maps are being made of a whole bunch of different, and the world is being explored by this point in time that I think people should really know, as maps are being made of South Africa and South America. Nicholas Alexandrov of Russia, he will die, along with the creation of the Triple Alliance formed in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay to fight Paraguay. Lewis Carroll is going to publish Alice in Wonderland in the early part of Andrew Johnson's presidency. Not to mention, too, the creation of the Salvation Army in London is going to effectively be created as well. One of the first meteorites, by the way, is going to fall into India, and they believe it's actually from Mars, which I think, just little things like that, I think are really cool. Little things in America as well. The KKK is going to be formed. 13th Amendment's going to be pushed into real full effect by the time Andrew Johnson's president. Alfred Nobel is going to invent his dynamite. And there's going to be a whole bunch of different assassination attempts all across Europe. Tsar Alexander II's going to barely escape an assassination attempt, a bombing, along with Otto von Bismarck himself. I believe he gets shot numerous times, and really pushes the idea of the Iron Man, the Iron Chancellor, I believe, or one of the Iron names around that point in time. London is going to start experiencing its own economic frustrations. The London banks start closing, and a lot of things are happening between Western countries and Eastern countries, as Korea and French troops are basically meeting each other for the first time. The Emperor of Japan dies near the end of Andrew Johnson's presidency. And also, the British surgeon Joseph Lister describes antiseptic surgery in his article, Lancelots. Singapore becomes a colony of Great Britain. Das Kapital by Karl Marx is unfortunately published. Not to mention, too, the failures of Napoleon III basically come full circle, as his dreams of world empires are killed basically by the fall of basically his French installation in Mexico. And Maximilian, the guy who's effectively the leader of that Mexican group, effectively is shot through a firing squad. The Meiji Restoration begins around this time in Japan, where Japan just effectively goes full bore to try and create as much creation as they possibly could, I guess you could say, in terms of trying to technologically advance and really push forward a whole bunch of Japan's industrial revolution to try and compete with Western theaters and whatnot. Riots in China begin, and Queen Isabella II is going to be sent to Spain in exile. Louis Simé Alcott is going to publish, at least the first part, Little Women. The fantastic novel was made into a movie like 15 times already. And I just want to point out, too, the first observance of Memorial Day, the Decoration Day, to remember all the fallen dead during the Civil War, is going to be created. And also, one of the many biographies that is found of many of the founding fathers, notably of Benjamin Franklin, is going to be published by this point in time as well. So everything mounting on, for the most part, Andrew Johnson. Many of the first things within the first couple months of his presidency were really just the fallout, in a lot of ways, of Abraham Lincoln's assassination and the end of the war. First and foremost, capturing a lot of the Confederate leaders, Abraham Lincoln's funeral. He won a lot of praise because he let Mary Lincoln stay there for like another couple months before the family moved in June, as she was mourning. But for the most part, most of it was really just dealing with just the after effects and the last little bits and tidbits of effectively what was the Civil War. Basically capturing John Wilkes Booth, basically negotiating Sherman's, I guess you could say, original terms when he basically won against General Johnson's surrender, and he felt Sherman was too much of a wussy and needed him to be more aggressive and to punish a lot of people, which, in the very beginning, the radical Republicans ultimately ended up really liking Johnson. A lot of it had to do with him begrudgingly accepting a lot of the I guess you could say the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, the freedman stuff, and by all indications that Johnson was giving, he was really just going to push forward Lincoln's plan, and at the very least the radical Republican revision of Lincoln's plan, and really punish the South for effectively most of the Civil War itself. Johnson's going to have a whole bunch of different perspectives and a whole bunch of different views on Reconstruction. But then that gets into the question, what is Reconstruction? Reconstruction, as how I just personally identify, ultimately is the period of time in which it's more than just actually reconstructing and building the South, but it's functionally making sure that a lot of the things that many of the men in the Civil War fought for ultimately would be held in every meaningful way, shape, and form, as the South is going to be eventually rejoining the Union over time. So basically Reconstruction meaning the philosophical and social, literal reconstruction of the South. Forced basically just desegregation, forcing people to work together, and basically going as far as, bringing blacks, Union soldiers into the South to enforce a whole bunch of different policies and disenfranchising a bit much of the white aristocracy that's down there and making everything as even as possible for the most part. Little things like that. But ultimately, it's just reconstructing the Union is how I would probably look at it personally and put it. And Johnson has a big Herculean task in front of him, and he has a whole bunch of different perspectives ultimately in how he's going to view Reconstruction. And for the radical Republicans, they wanted to expand the concept of the federal powers in order to basically create the equality for the blacks as they foresaw it for the most part. But Johnson, first and foremost, did not like black people. Let's just be honest with it. Although he had, I think, like I said before, a very complicated relationship with them, ultimately. I still don't think he liked them, especially by this point in time. And, one's opinion's going to change when everyone's hating on you for not liking the black people and helping them. And it's just like, well, fuck these guys, people's opinions, how it goes. But for Andrew Johnson, for him, he's always been a very aggressively strict constructionist on the Constitution, and was a very he's always been that way. And specifically the specific strict version and variation of the Jefferson ideals of states' rights and secession. Because on one hand, he's basically thinking of Lincoln's reasonings, that the white traitors should be punished, but that they hadn't, technically speaking, like at the same. Let me put it to you this way: it's like they should be punished, but we also had 600,000 dead men. That basically just said that, look, we can't have more bloodshed and more fighting, because if you just force this upon them, more things and more bad things are going to happen. And for Andrew Johnson, how could and should the Southern states be treated? In Johnson's mind, he felt that, the issue was very simple, really. Impose certain conditions to basically make things very easy for them in a lot of ways. Certain easy conditions, sorry about that. And basically just abolish slavery and basically just do basic loyalty oaths. But you don't have to impose the black suffrage as a condition of readmission within the Union itself, So he's basically just saying, look, we're basically just saying they're free, technically speaking, but we're not going to change anything ultimately, because doing so is going to violate the popular sovereignty of the individual, and not to mention the issue of the individual and the state and states' rights. But specifically, if I'm going to get into it, when Congress had convened to talk about, their versions of yada 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 Reconstruction, Johnson ultimately ended up unveiling his plan. It would basically be this: we'll appoint a territorial governor for the particular state. We'll hold another state constitutional convention. And once 10% of the voting population had sworn an oath of allegiance, the state would basically be able to draft a new constitution, end slavery, and effectively just rejoin the Union and gain citizenship. And there's two reasons ultimately that I think are the biggest reasons why he had that specific I guess you could say, line. The first was what I had just said before, was, states' rights, et cetera, and, let's not punish these people more than we have to. But ultimately, and in fairness, I will say this, the main reason, or one of the other smaller but, generally acceptable main reason, is that he wanted the states to resume self-governance. He wanted them to basically be a part of the Union and be themselves, as, again, he's a states' rights person, and ultimately felt that the quicker they can get off on their feet, get some, maybe even get some federal help in order to help quickly reconstruct everything and get everything into place, the better, ultimately. Well, this really pissed off every single Republican and pissed off even just normal, regular, just Democratic individuals, I guess you could say, because a lot of them were like, dude, what are you doing? Like, we're not going to fight another war over this, are we? And, a lot of people were very mad. They didn't say anything about black people voting. And basically, a lot of people felt that if they went down this path, this would just be basically beyond all belief and recognition, business as usual. Over the course of the next couple of months, once he moves into the White House, a whole bunch of different people like Jefferson Davis are being hunted down. Effectively, he starts appointing a lot of the territorial governors, specifically, I believe, starting with, what's his name? Sharkey, William L. Sharkey, as the provisional governor of Mississippi. And over the next few weeks, Johnson starts appointing a whole bunch of different provisional governors: Georgia, Texas, Alabama, South Carolina, Florida, and basically assigns all of them tasks of overseeing reconstruction plans within the South. And a lot of these governors are not very, how do I put it, Republicans. They're not very union type people, I guess you could say. In fact, the Alabama governor specifically says that every political right which a state possessed under the federal constitution is here today, with the single exception relating to slavery. And a whole bunch of the southern governors started implementing a whole bunch of their own state conventions, turning new elections, getting a whole bunch of different people, a lot of these being former secessionists, which triumphed, or they won their elections without any, voter fraud whatsoever going on, and started implementing a whole bunch of different laws, rules, and regulations, notably what is known as the strict black codes, which, effectively just recreated slavery. Now, these laws varied from state to state, but basically former slaves had to carry permits on their body when they were off the plantations. They were to observe town curfews, sign contracts of employment, and effectively enforce them into slave-like employment service on these specific plantations. For one example, one of the books gives is that every single slave youth was required to be apprenticed to an employer, who themselves could exercise paternal authority over the young wards. And basically, it just made things all the more complicated, and basically just created slavery 2.0, basically, within the South. Johnson, for basically many months during this time, overturned a whole bunch of different orders from Congress, and specifically from the Freedmen's Bureau. A lot of people were kind of seeing what was happening and were not very happy about what was specifically happening. The Freedmen's Bureau, by the way, was an agency created by technically Congress and Abraham Lincoln in March of 1865 to help support relief of basically the black people in the South, providing both aid to both whites and blacks specifically. And he started basically, Johnson started purging a lot of officers in the South specifically that were part of the Freedmen's Bureau in favor of the Southern whites, and it was just not a good situation for the most part. He basically just let everything go for the most part in order to allow the South to come back into the Union much more quickly, much more ferociously, and far more so in the eyes of just aggressively against slavery, even more so. I mean, punishments were much more harsher, I think. Like I said before, I think the Free State of Jones does a really good interpretation, really good view and look at what life was like after the Civil War for a lot of these people as well. It was very dark. It was very horrible. And the truth is that Andrew Johnson failed in every semblance, and he just failed, which to be quite honest with you. No matter, his upbringing, he just failed in his duties of what he was supposed to do in terms of the Reconstruction and the ideas of the Reconstruction plans that Abraham Lincoln had initially attempted to implement. Unfortunately for Andrew Johnson, people were getting wind of it. They were seeing what was happening, and by the time Congress comes back in December of 1865, everyone, and I mean everyone, was mad. Okay, even the most not radical Republicans were very pissed off, and he basically just got everyone on his bad side. This congressional session for the next two Congresses is going to be kind of hell for Andrew Johnson. It still has an overwhelming Republican majority in both houses, and a lot of bills are going to be pushed through. Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull is going to try and extend the bill extending the Freedmen's Bureau beyond the scheduled abolition of 1865, while Congress is trying to push forward the civil rights bills, which Johnson attempts to veto both of them. The Civil Rights Bill specifically gives birthright citizenship to all the individuals born in the United States, with the exception of Native Americans, and declare that no state could violate the fundamental rights of the United States citizens. And he tries to get them both vetoed on specific, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you, like technical grounds for the most part. The civil rights one specifically, because the states technically hadn't joined the Union yet. He's basically like, we can't impose this bill because they haven't technically joined the Union. So everyone's basically like, are you fucking kidding me, dude? Like, and ultimately ends up vetoing his veto of both bills, and had really pushed forward a whole bunch of other, I guess you could say, civil rights legislation that Johnson's just going to combat in every sense of the word. The Republicans in Congress also makes a break with the Republicans very much soon after. Here's the thing, you have to understand too, a lot of the moderate Republicans in particular were very hopeful that Johnson would kind of come around in particular, and ultimately we're still very faithful that he would still uphold his duties as the executive in chief, but ultimately Johnson's kind of tied by his own personal bullshit for the most part, if I'm just going to be 100% honest with you, his own personal stuff, and his own issues with black people, etc., but also just like he's really just trying to be both states' rights, but also trying to, let's just be honest, help get people back into the Union and back to working and back to doing everything and just bringing the Union together for the most part. That being said, he's not helping himself with a lot of the things that he's doing, and a lot of people, especially in media, a whole bunch of different of those like little cartoons or whatnot, caricatures, making Andrew Johnson look like a racist monster for the most part. And don't get me wrong, he's absolutely not helping himself. Before we continue into the whole more domestic policy, should probably talk about very briefly Andrew Johnson's foreign policy. It's going to be very brief, but for the most part, Andrew Johnson worked pretty well for the most part with William Seward in most effects, although they did not really like each other, specifically because Seward was an ardent abolitionist and Johnson wasn't. But Seward ran very well a really aggressive expansionist foreign policy. He worked with Tsar Alexander II and worked really hard, but somehow managed to get on 2 cents an acre to sell Alaska to the United States for basically about $7 million, 500,000 square miles of land, and a whole bunch of different things as well. But basically, the United States wanted to annex much of just the northern areas, and basically to push forward more of a expansionist policy. A lot of people felt very all over the place, to be quite honest, with William Seward's purchase of Alaska. They called it Seward's Folly, but for the most part, if I can get a shit ton of land for 2 cents on the dollar, why not? And ultimately, he pushed for, but was unable to gain basically Senate consent to try and annex a whole bunch of different places, specifically the northern parts of Canada and the Virgin Islands, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and even Iceland. Going as far from that as well. There's a whole bunch of different things going on with Mexico too, and the French, Napoleon III. Basically, Archduke Maximilian of Austria was the emperor, I guess you could say, of Mexico. And Benito Juarez, he led this resistance force against the French, and forces against Napoleon III, who was trying to create and dominate Mexico with his own monarchy and stuff like that. And as soon as the American Civil War ended, the war did not end for the United States. The Secretary of State sent about 50,000 very battle-tested United States soldiers to the Mexican border. And they basically helped back up Mexico with its demand that Napoleon withdraw all its forces, and Napoleon ended up leaving. And effectively speaking, this was just a continuation of the Monroe Doctrine in a lot of ways. I would also say that the one good thing I would say with Johnson's presidency was that the relationship with Great Britain was really repaired, a lot of it with the help of Seward. Johnson really helped effectively with a whole bunch of some rules, regulations, really stopping what was known as these Irish American Fenians. They were effectively attacking parts of Canada and trying to gain land and territory for the United States, and really, basically just said, stop, what are you doing? Bad Irish Americans, yada yada. But anyways, both sides would effectively restart negotiations, trade, and become pretty Gucci for the most parts with one another. So anyways, to continue down the domestic timeline, a lot of things are happening within the next, once Congress comes back. Like I said, Johnson's going to veto the Civil Rights Bill like 3 times, well, 2 times I think technically, and basically, what am I saying? He vetoes the act twice, and then denounces the Republican Party as a whole, effectively. Not really the whole entire Republican Party, but especially and specifically the radical Republicans. Because the division was already growing. The divide between the two parties is already just growing again, specifically between Johnson and the Republicans who control all of the federal government. They basically he just straight up goes to the Senate floor and is like, you guys are all crazy. I denounce all of you, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and that, you guys are all just hypocrites, monsters, etc., etc. You don't actually care about freedmen, etc., etc., and you don't really care about yada, yada, yada. Little things like that. Just, it's all political, whatever you want to call it. And it's unfortunate because this relationship in this act would really just basically turn any chance that Andrew Johnson had at any semblance of a easy presidency just out the window. Mary Todd Lincoln herself did not like Andrew Johnson from this point on, in which case he would actually go visit her while on the campaign trail for the midterm elections and basically just says, ugh, go fuck yourself. Ugh, Congress, though, has an overwhelming majority, though, so while a whole bunch of different things are happening within the country, notably that whole Fenian raid that I was talking to you about with Great Britain and Canada, it's going to happen very early on, but ultimately ends up being basically, what you would call it, a failed coup against Canada. Kind of becomes a bit of a bargaining tool, but I'm getting way ahead of myself with that because I don't know the entirety of that particular event. But ultimately, Congress, for the better part of a couple months, has been trying to pass the 14th Amendment, since he's not going to pass any of the civil rights bills, etc., the Freedmen's Bureau. Basically, the radical Republicans, I guess you could say, or the Republicans in general, basically push for the 14th Amendment, which is seek to prevent first off, the whole point is that it stops the ex-Confederates from holding office, but it also establishes that the citizenship of African Americans are affirmed, that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction thereof, the United States and any part of the United States when they specifically reside in. The amendment will basically reverse, I think, Dred Scott specifically, that they're no longer property, etc., and that once you're born on this property, you will be a United States citizen. And he's going to try and stop it again, obviously, but he can't stop it because there's such an overwhelming majority of Republicans that it's just, yeah. So the 14th Amendment has to be ratified by all the states, basically, and surprisingly, none of the states in the South ratify it. except one state, and surprisingly, it is Tennessee. Tennessee will ratify the 14th Amendment and be the only southern state to do so. From basically June of 1866 to the end of the year, a lot of things are happening. The Reconstruction is going on. Black people are being oppressed. Black codes. Not a lot of things are happening. And Congress is at odds with this still not ratified southern states. They're not readmitted to the Union quite yet, except for Tennessee. Tennessee will be back in the Union after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. Midterm elections coming around, and this country is still divided by every sense of the imagination. It's unfortunate because a year and a half ago people were celebrating after the end of the Civil War, yet things are just as dire as they've ever been. So Johnson decides that in order to stop the gridlock in Congress, to try and get some more Democratic supporters in, he goes around what is known as his speaking tour called the Swing Around the Circle. He goes all across the country, and specifically the Midwest, unfortunately, where he kind of goes a little bit crazy, and I think he kind of gets into his head a little bit. There's some stories about him considering and comparing himself to Christ, and basically a lot of people were, I guess you could say, not happy with him for the most part. And a lot of people no one liked Johnson. I just gotta be honest with you. No one liked Andrew Johnson. No one in his own cabinet, I think, even really wanted to support him. But people like William Seward did not want to break party lines. It didn't want to break the entire country by basically resigning like crazy. At this point, a couple of his cabinet members had already left, but for the most part because Seward wanted to keep doing his foreign policy thing. But for the most part, he attempted to travel the country to try and get a whole bunch of different people to vote for the Democrats and to try and boost Democratic, I guess you could say, support in every sense of the word. He hopes to campaign and get some of the radical Republicans out of the office. Unfortunately, when November 1st comes around, Johnson suffers a lot of congressional losses to the radical Republicans. Northerners are not convinced at all by the president's, assertions that, because he's basically saying all the whites in the South are fully remorseful for the Civil War and they become Unionists, and everyone's like, dude, they're not going to ratify any basic stuff that we just fought for, so just stop it, okay? Riots were starting to occur in New Orleans, Memphis, and specifically people with a lot of black cities. There's actually one unfortunate story. I forgot which. I remember reading about it. It was a big, basically just straight up occupation against a group of black people who were basically just trying to talk about the constitutional rights, and it's rough post-Civil War, and Andrew Johnson absolutely does not help in any meaningful way to help reconciliate this country and bring this country together. He only separates people more and more. The Republicans win so much they end up enjoying 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. Anyways, on some brighter news after that, though, Nebraska will become a state and will finally join the Union. Anyways, with this new Republican majority, 2/3, they basically just have free reign to do what they wanted to do. They basically, every single time Andrew Johnson attempts to veto, it fails miserably, and Republicans just basically veto everything. They had a majority of everything, and basically they just said, if you're not going to ratify the 14th Amendment or anything that we're going to do, fine. So effectively, Thaddeus Stevens introduces legislation and basically destroys the southern initial Reconstruction state governments and basically creates them into, military districts under just aggressively strict martial law. All the state governments would be basically reconstituted and reformed, holding more other state constitutional conventions, and that black people could vote and become delegates even in these conventions, while former people who were a part of the Confederacy could not. And basically they ended up adding a whole bunch of different bills and provisions that basically said that, hey, if you're going to ratify the 14th Amendment and become a part of the Union, you got to do a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And Southerners basically fearing that, oh shit, okay, hey guys, we will do whatever you guys want. We can do modified versions of stuff. We can just please, you know what I'm saying, just let us not be under strict martial law, effectively, for the most part. But effectively, they just said, fuck it, we're just going to do everything, and they just went what would be known as the First Reconstruction Act. The First Reconstruction Act basically it's the main centerpiece of the Radical Reconstruction period, where Congress basically just fully took away all Reconstruction powers away from Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson still had a lot of power, though. He had a lot of power to command and stop a lot of the things with the Freedmen's Bureau. But for the most part, his ability to control the Army, the Navy, etc., a whole bunch of different things that he normally would have, he just lost all power and lost all capability. And because of him losing all this stuff, one of the other new bills that would be a part of Congress would be known as the Office of Tenure Act, or the Tenure of Office Act. Basically saying that before any president could remove any cabinet member, they actually had to go through the Senate first, which is going to set up basically Johnson's impeachment trial. But I'll get to that effectively in a little bit. Anyways, though, basically once the First Reconstruction Act kind of goes through, things were very contentious. People were basically fighting each other still. It did not help a whole bunch of different things, aggressively so. But black people were able to vote, and it really stopped ex-Confederates from reestablishing their political and racial dominance. Johnson genuinely felt like he was being trapped in a lot of ways and blocked at every turn. He was really left without any options, really any power to do anything. In certain aspects, I think he thought he was doing the right thing, but at the very same time, too, he is, in fairness, someone that does not believe the black man is equal to the white man in any way, shape, and form. And while the South is basically being controlled under martial law into military districts until they are, basically accept the Union as the Almighty God, yada yada, and basically give the black man equal freedoms, etc., etc. Johnson really doesn't have any power. Every single act that Congress pushes through, aggressively so, basically gives them carte blanche to do whatever they want. And in fact, a lot of the acts that tend to go through challenge a whole bunch of different things that Johnson should be able to do. The Command of the Army Act basically gives Ulysses S. Grant carte blanche to do whatever he wants with the Army, and Ulysses S. Grant and Stanton to really do whatever he wanted to do for the most part within what was going to happen during the Reconstruction South. And basically, since there's such an overwhelming majority in Congress in both houses, that there's really no need to the whole checks and balances, which unfortunately I'm a checks and balances kind of person. It basically just gets subsided when there's such an overwhelming majority, which is the only negative aspect of the whole constitutional Congress and just the Constitution in general, I think. But checks and balances generally do work, and this is clearly a one-sided issue against Andrew Johnson for the betterment of the country. And Johnson just challenged this and challenged the whole status quo and did whatever he could. Basically from March all the way until June, he's just combating Congress in any meaningful way that he possibly could. He objected to the passing of all the laws that had not been voted, that the affected states in particular, the southern states, had not voted in particular. And once the act became law, cabinet members urged him to act with haste in appointing all the people that were supposed to be appointed, specifically with the first act, or I guess the First Reconstruction Act specifically. He was the one that was supposed to appoint all the 5 commanders, but he basically lollygagged and did everything that he possibly could to really basically stall everything. Say what you will, but checks and balances works in a lot of instances, and this is unfortunate when, the rights of black people in the South are basically just getting destroyed for the most part. And unfortunately, there really was nowhere else to go other than impeachment. To explain the very first impeachment of a sitting president in this country's history, you should probably understand the situation Johnson's in. I think I kind of went with it pretty well, but like I said, he's backed into a corner. He's basically been stripped of a lot of the powers that he has, but he's still the president, and he still has some semblance of authority. But anything that he does could lead to impeachment, and he knows this too. He's not naive to the reality that he could be impeached as a president. In fact, he knows very well that he will be impeached at some point. So he's kind of just saying, fuck it, I really don't care anymore. On August 12th of 1867, it's a fascinating story, by the way, which people should read into, but Andrew Johnson effectively ends up dismissing the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, while Congress is out of session. It's a really fascinating conversation, I guess you could say, between the person who is dismissing Stanton, et cetera, who's the person that's supposed to be taking Stanton's place. It's really fascinating because it's a whole bunch of different people. He tries to get Grant, but Grant and Stanton are kind of working together because he basically Stanton is the one that's really in charge of the Reconstruction plans, and Grant's kind of helping and assisting with the military authority down in the South. And Grant's like, nah, I'm good. And then a whole bunch of different people are kind of mad about this, and it reaches a breaking point. Because you have to understand too, the Senate initially refused to do so because of the Tenure of Office Act, Office of Tenure Act, and specifically for quite some time, kind of was in a bit of a weird stalemate, and specifically a weird deadlock between Congress and Andrew Johnson in particular. Grant basically broke off everything with the president, just said, you're a fool right now. You guys, what are you doing? As crises are starting to flare up again in the South, and people are not happy with everything that's happening. On February 21st, 1868, though, Johnson would once again try to dismiss Edwin Stanton one more time, and literally just a couple days later, the House decided to vote to impeach Andrew Johnson, a vote of 126 to 47. They didn't hold any hearings or have specific charges against him, but they just said, we are going to come up subsequently with a whole bunch of different charges because, Mr. Andrew Johnson, you are violating a whole bunch of different shit, yada, yada, yada. The House actually had meetings before, and hearings, whether or not to determine whether they were going to impeach him. But, once, and let's be honest, this impeachment was purely politically influenced and motivated. Stanton was told by the people and the Republicans to basically stand his ground, to basically force effectively this impeachment. Whatever your opinion is of Andrew Johnson, this impeachment is baloney, to be quite honest with you, and grossly overblown. But effectively, the House voted to impeach the president for high crimes and misdemeanors. 11 charges were filed. The first and main ones were the violation of the Tenure of Office Act, and specifically the Command of the Army Act, and also charges against actions they brought disgrace, ridicule to the presidency, and just a whole bunch of different other little tidbits and things for the most part. Andrew Johnson was going to have about 1 month delay, specifically received 10 days to basically create a defensive team. Ultimately, I believe his Attorney General would end up becoming a part of that defensive team, as well as Andrew Johnson's like, this is all fucking bogus, but it's politics, baby. It is what it is, and life is going to be very difficult for Andrew Johnson for the next couple of months. Very briefly, I just want to talk about the principled issues, I would say specifically why this occurred, because this is clearly the complicated issue of politics, and not even necessarily the issue of law, but specifically just the political machinations, ultimately, which lay at the very center between Andrew Johnson and specifically Congress, who were both fighting over not only which government agency should oversee Reconstruction, but also which section of the government should actually, which branch of government should actually oversee Reconstruction. And the real fundamental issues really were very clear and very, were very just out in the open, to be quite honest with you. Congress told Andrew Johnson to do something, and Andrew Johnson refused to do it, specifically with his implementation with the U.S. Army to implement its policies of Reconstruction. Basically, the military, I guess, my brain's not working. The military Southern, I guess you could say, domination down there in order to enforce a lot of the acts and a lot of the rules of law that Reconstruction was supposed to entail to help protect the rights of black people. And basically, Andrew Johnson violated that in every sense of the word, and had in turn, over the summer, had actually attempted to remove a couple of the military commanders that Congress had put in the South that had basically supported, I guess you could say, the white aristocracy down there and the white rule in the South. A lot of people say he tried to create his Army of the Atlantic down there because of, the high level and volume and the strength that a lot of those Southern military leaders had, and governor leaders, I guess you could say, had within the South, meant that he had a small little army down there that threatened Congress and that wanted to intimidate Congress, hypothetically speaking. I don't know if... there's a lot of... stories and a whole bunch of information that go back and forth, but it's pretty much agreed that the South was becoming geared up in a lot of ways and prepared, not necessarily to revolt in any sense of the word, but this was a very tense time, to put it plainly, between Congress, the presidency, North, and the South. And in particular, Grant himself was very upset. He basically turned against the president because he felt that he was just creating more, I guess you could say, division between North and the South. And he's like, I'm not trying to fight another civil war again. I've already sent a lot of men to die. I'm not doing that again. And the main issue, too, was, he just had lost so much support for... The trial began on March 30th of 1868. Andrew Johnson really wasn't a part of a lot of the proceedings, which he was upset by, but it is what it is, baby. The main thing that they really focused upon was the Tenure of Office Act, which it was the one thing that they argued was unconstitutional, and it wasn't it shouldn't have been applied specifically to Edwin Stanton's firing as the Secretary of War. And, this trial would last for about 6 weeks. Each side basically putting in their witnesses, espousing their every little thing that they could have possibly taken. And there's a whole bunch of different things that go along with this entire impeachment that has to be... I can't go along in it, but I could probably talk about this entire impeachment trial for 2 hours, but it's going to be too long, and, I just want to really finish up Andrew Johnson as succinctly as I possibly could. First things first, you have to understand, in order to impeach the president, they basically needed 2/3 majority. It was in the Senate, it was in the House. They needed 2/3 majority of voting, I guess you could say. And Johnson felt that they had a lot of... Look, they had two things working for them. One, technically speaking, it's not technically impeachable or clearly impeachable offenses, and above all else, he had no vice president, so you have to remember that. So the person that would have been the president after him was Benjamin Wade. I believe he was the president of the pro temp of the Senate, and he was, a real extreme radical Republican, soft money, pro-labor, and Northern businessmen were like, no, no good. And the Senate Democrats in there basically said that what they needed was at least 7 Republicans to not vote in order to avoid removal, for the most part. 3 of the articles were voted on, and each time 7 Republicans sided with the Democrats against the removal of the president, effectively. And to put it plainly, I guess you could say, most of the people who end up siding with the with the Democrats specifically were supporters of Grant, and were, I guess, moderate people who didn't want to destroy the country, I guess you could say, by creating a Congress that was going to be clearly vindictive in a lot of ways. But for the most part, Andrew Johnson will not be convicted on the slimmest of margins for a whole bunch of different reasons. There's actually a really big speech from a specific politician. He gives a really good, I forgot what the speech was. He just goes on the Senate floor and basically just says, if we start this, there's no going back, and we've basically just fought civil war and 600,000 plus men died, and we're not going to make a mockery of everything that they fought and that they died for. The final vote maintained the principle that the Congress should not remove the president from the office simply because its members disagreed with him over policy, style, and administration of the office. But at the same time, the president did not mean the president retained governing power. So for the rest of his term, Andrew Johnson basically could not and would not be able to institute anything. Woodrow Wilson, I don't like him very much, but he would refer to this particular government as the congressional government, because basically Congress and the radical Republicans would influence this country for the next, basically several decades, because of Andrew Johnson, effectively, for the most part, which is very, very big, and, this is going to lead to what will be the Gilded Age within this country. What does Johnson do effectively for the last couple months of his presidency? Once he's acquitted in May 26th, 1868, a couple things happen. They actually hold the RNC very briefly to nominate Ulysses S. Grant, who is going to have Schuyler Colfax as his vice president, even though Grant has no political experience whatsoever. Johnson's going to just try and do a couple things. He attempts to have a couple of the ex-Confederate states back to the Union. Congress overrides these vetoes and bills until, the Confederate states pledge their loyalties, etc., etc. Burlingame Treaty ends up being ratified submits the Burlingame Treaty between the United States and China for Senate approval to try and hammer out United States and China relations. But for the most part, Johnson effectively just spends the last year of his presidency doing nothing. Grant will beat Horatio Seymour by effectively barely about 300,000 votes. There's still such a big North and South discrepancy specifically, or Democrat and Republican discrepancy specifically. But I'll get to that when I talk about Grant. And Andrew Johnson, with the reality that he's not going to get the nomination for the Democratic Party, understands that he's in the twilight of his political career, above all else. And I can go far more into a whole bunch of different things with Andrew Johnson, but I'd rather leave this impeachment trial and a lot of the Reconstruction era in particular to specific episodes I do plan to do later on specifically. And for Andrew Johnson, he effectively just ends the last year of his presidency vibing, having kids' birthday parties because he loves his grandkids, and just dealing with a whole bunch of different family issues, because I probably should have gone more into it during the actual presidency, that his family life is all over the place. His wife, Eliza, while still loving and supportive, is very sick. She's been sick for quite some time, since the days of Tennessee. She had been recovering from tuberculosis, which ravaged her and made her invalid, I guess you could say, or invalid, which is why Martha, the oldest, ended up being the main female White House hostess during the time of Andrew Johnson's presidency. But his oldest son, Robert, had depression. Just to quickly say it, he will eventually commit suicide. And his second son, Charles, died in the war, I believe, which is very difficult in the family, and had a very profound effect on how I think he was initially planning to legislate in a lot of ways. And then his youngest son, Frank, had just graduated college. So, things were looking up for the Johnsons and the family, although, politically they were outcasts in a lot of ways, even though they held the highest office in the land. For 7 to 8 months, he's just chilling, doing nothing, and really just wanting to enjoy the last couple of moments of his presidency. Once inauguration day comes for Ulysses S. Grant, it's a bit touchy. It's all over the place. Johnson and Grant clearly do not like each other. They do not share a carriage with each other, and Johnson is asked to leave by Grant before the, I guess you could say, inauguration festivities begin for the betterment of the country. Johnson returned home to Tennessee for really the first time in quite a long time, and he came back thinking that, life was going to be a bit difficult, since he had not been to Greenville in about 8 years specifically, and, Tennessee, when he left, initially called him a traitor, but when he came back, despite being one of the most racially inflamed presidents, ultimately ended up kind of being called the Patriot. They welcomed him back with open arms, and a lot of people really liked him. A lot of people hung out welcome banners. He had frequent guests left and right, and despite the death of his son, which embittered public life in a lot of ways for Andrew Johnson, he basically decided he was going to try and just live his life for the most part. He enjoyed being with the kids and really just enjoying business, really, and made some money, and lost some money specifically too. He'd actually lose some money when one of the banks would go through, although he ended up being repaid a lot of the sums, the First National Bank of Washington, I believe. For about, I would say, a couple years actually, things were going swimmingly for the most part. His wife was physically incapable, but she survived, and he was always there for her. And the family, for the most part, was generally pretty happy. But life was pretty boring for the aging Andrew Johnson, who was in his early 60s by this point. He decided that he might throw his name in there for political office. It was impossible to stay away from politics, which had basically gone through Tennessee, and Tennessee had gone Republican, especially in the state legislature. So whenever he could, he'd take pot shots at Grant for his policies, left and right. Excuse me. And a lot of people thought he might actually run for governor or the Senate again. And thinking that he might need some vindication for himself, thinking that, I might have been a failure as a president, but I'm not a failure as a politician, or, he wanted some vindication and wanted some revenge for a lot of the stuff that happened with his political enemies. So he decided, I'm going to launch a Senate campaign. Sorry for my dogs barking. Tennessee, like I said, had gone Republican, but things were happening. Ku Klux Klan is a thing, and Democrats were still pretty prominent, especially within the South and effectively the Deep South. So he launches an election bid, effectively, for a Senate seat once he first gets in back in 1869, and then I believe 1872. 1869 he will lose, but in 1872, in a special election for the congressional seat for Tennessee, he ultimately, that one's complicated, but he ends up splitting that vote, finishing third in favor for the Democratic guy in order to help the Democratic guy, I think, get in. 73, 74, he's getting a little bit older, but he's like, I'll try one more time, because he had just caught cholera during the specific epidemic, but ultimately ends up surviving it, and decides he's going to try and take place another election bid in 1875. He basically started changing his movements and his political leanings in a whole bunch of different ways, and started gaining a whole bunch of different support from a whole bunch of different people, and ultimately ends up, long story short, winning this election with basically the margin, I guess you could say, of a single vote within his state legislature. Andrew Johnson is going to be the very first, and I believe the only senator and former president to actually join the Senate after becoming the president. You have to remember John Quincy Adams joined the House after his presidency, not the Senate. The comeback was very, very short-lived, unfortunately, for Andrew Johnson, to be unfortunate. There's just no other way to put it. On his trip back from a special session, he basically went to go visit his daughter Mary in Elizabethton, where at least where her daughter Mary was staying. And when he went to go visit her, he suffered a stroke. He refused medical treatment, and she just thought he was going to get better. He's like, "Oh, I'm fine," But unfortunately, days and days later, he just did not respond to any sort of treatments whatsoever. Andrew Johnson would suffer another stroke on the evening of July 30th, 1875. Andrew Johnson would die on July 31st, 1875, the next day. He was 66 years old, and President Grant basically told people that he is the only technical president alive. All the other former presidents had died at that point. Andrew Johnson was the last only surviving president from that point on. His wife, Eliza, would die a year later. On his casket laid an American flag and a personal copy of the Constitution. And basically, that flag he loved so much that he ended up supporting for the last 40 years of his life. What is the legacy of Andrew Johnson? To be quite honest, it's interesting. I don't know how I quite feel about it, to be honest with you. But let me work out my feelings and my thoughts real quick, just in this little bubble that I'm in right now. Because, you have to look at everything. I think we put too much reality into the fact that, don't get me wrong. Andrew Johnson, I think, is just not a friend to black people. He's not an avowed racist, but I think by definition he is a racist, because I think he functionally believes the white man is better than the black man in every meaningful way. He would have preferred white men to fight in the war because black men were incapable of fighting in the war. At least that's what I think part of his opinion was. And ultimately, I go back and forth, because you have to understand he did mess up on a lot of things. He had a different perspective on how he was going to do a whole bunch of different things. And, people just had disagreements functionally about it, because ultimately it just seemed like it was everything that he was implementing was only going to cause basically all the same struggles and problems that they had just fought a war over. And ultimately, no one wanted to deal with that. And I don't think it's difficult for anybody in general to deal with that, It's unfortunate that Lincoln died. The great what if, really, but, you can't live your lives on what ifs, in my personal view. That being said, you're talking about a Herculean task. A civil war is one thing, but, it's like with FDR. Like, FDR is great and whatnot and yada yada, but, no one gives Harry Truman the credit for effectively dealing with the fallout of everything. The rise of communism, aggressively so, into a whole bunch of the Eastern European countries, Asia, the reconstruction of basically Germany and a whole bunch of different, just Europe in general, and, the efforts that it was going to take to fix everything. Which is why I tend to hold Harry Truman in much higher regard. And you're asking, Andrew Johnson to basically do the exact same thing. America's in tatters, and we're basically holding on by a thread in a lot of ways. This government and country is holding on, by a thread in a lot of ways, to a point where, even the radical Republicans themselves have to go on a tightrope without actively violating and doing a whole bunch of different things that they ended up having to do prior to the whole impeachment saga and prior to the whole battling each other, because they know it's very contentious. They know that anything could be a spark plug that's going to start Civil War 2.0. And you're asking a man to rebuild this country in the way that it was going to be sufficient, that was going to, like I said, everyone has their own perspective and point of view on how they're trying to do things and how they want to implement a whole bunch of different things. And I just want to throw out there, too, that look, he has his own particular perspective of how he wants to do things and how he wants to specifically implement things. And even if it's wrong, he still has that right. And I think it's wrong, and he should have worked with Congress, at least in this particular point in time, because it seemed very advantageous and really should have worked with Congress in order to implement a lot of the things that are going to help ease the Reconstruction era within the United States. And ultimately, he did not do a lot of those things. So really, with me, I don't look at Andrew Johnson in the highest regard, but I understand a lot of people who will ultimately defend Johnson at some points to try and put up the counterintuitive perspective to try and rehabilitate the image, and that, you're asking him to do quite literally a lot of different things. And the truth is that even the radical Republicans and a lot of other people, northern businessmen and a whole bunch of different southern aristocracy, everyone has their fingers on what they want to do. It's all political, it's all biased in a whole bunch of different ways, and it's like, yeah, you know what, the radical Republicans are technically on the right side of history too, but they also are trying to make a mockery of the government to impeach the president because they don't like the little things that they do, or the little things that Johnson does, instead of trying to make things work with him. They were actually going pretty well for the most part until the impeachment process happened. So, it just really depends on how one looks at it. I guess I look at it this way, I understand that the Reconstruction period is very difficult. It's hard. But to counter that too, there's a reality that Andrew Johnson, for whatever reason, just in some of my research, I don't think he functionally understood the severity of what a lot of the stuff was happening, I guess you could say. I think he didn't, there's such a disassociation in a lot of ways with the treatment of black people that he's kind of just putting it out of his mind at times. And that's what it just seems like when I read some of the stuff about Andrew Johnson, that it's very clear that it's not that he doesn't care. I think he's actively putting it out of his mind just so that he could push something forward that's going to be the quickest solution to try and get everything back to the status quo. His sole focus is to bring people back into the Union, that he's forgetting the sole purpose of Reconstruction and why the Civil War was even fought for just in the beginning. And I think that's the fault of Andrew Johnson. There's a clear disassociation with a lot of the things that he's doing, and you can say it's racism. I just think that, I don't want to say it really is because of racism. I just think he just doesn't care. And he doesn't care about the black people, and doesn't care specifically. And I think that's different from racism. He's not actively attacking them. He's just basically like, look, can we just get this thing over with and go? Instead of saying, like, I don't like you for you, yada, yada, yada. Then I'm going to make you suffer for all this. That's not what I think of when I think of Andrew Johnson. I think it's just blatant, I'm going to block this out of my mind, and then you're just going to have to deal with a whole bunch of different things. Black people in the South. But then again, that's just my perspective. He's certainly not going to be any civil rights leader, at least legacy-wise, by any stretch of the imagination. But he's our president, and I just think he's a president that kind of gets shit on in a lot of ways because history is not very kind to people, even if you're in a particularly shitty situation, And did he do some good things? Yeah, I think he did. I think Alaska is a fascinating territory that he was able to acquire with William Seward, and I think, he had good intentions. I think ultimately, though, once radical Republicans pushed, and they kept pushing, and they kept trying to implement all the things that he felt were very unconstitutional, regardless of race, creed, etc., he just shut down and began to shut down. And once he began to shut down, everything started becoming and shutting down shut down immediately after that. So, I look at that, and I look at just basically the contention between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans, because I don't even really go that much into it, to be quite honest with you. He really hates the radical Republicans specifically. He doesn't like the Republican Party, but he puts the Republicans in a particular spot that the radical Republicans are basically saying, you're with us or you're against us, and the Republicans are just basically like, sorry, Andrew, you're out of here. You're going to be done, bro, so we can't really help you with any little thing whatsoever. Andrew Johnson fails as a president for not upholding his specific duties to help all people, for not recognizing the reality of the Civil War, the cost of the Civil War, and specifically what's going to take to do this Reconstruction period right, in the reality just because of the Civil War itself, and also just not being able to work with Congress, which is frustrating, because if he truly believes in the Constitution, then he should really understand the checks and balances. It's a give and take, and there's some things that are clearly that the radical Republicans were doing that were very aggressive, don't get me wrong, but the very same end of the spectrum, like, I feel like a Civil Rights Act, even if it is federally imposed on the states' rights, you are losing it in that point, and you're not looking at things in this new world that you're trying to everyone's trying to create effectively, that's going to help bring people in. You're not looking at reality as it should be looked at, and I think that's why I look at Andrew Johnson. I just look at him and I think something's missing, and he's doing things not because of specifically racism, but just pure blatant disregard for people, for the most expedient results, that in fairness will favor white Southern aristocracy. And he had one idea, and I think he believed in that one idea, but I think once things started settling, he's kind of coming and talking to a whole bunch of different people and coming to a whole bunch of different conclusions, and he's just like, well, I mean, the South technically would know how they're going to rebuild the South, and for the South, they're trying to figure things out too, like, how are we going to rebuild? Are we going to rebuild in this particular way? Are we going to rebuild the same towns that have been destroyed by Sherman's march, etc., etc., or are we going to build it with a much more better infrastructure, better roads and systems, etc., etc.? A lot of things are going to cost money. I'm just telling you, like, when you look at Reconstruction, there's so many things that go along with it that, it's very hard. I only broadly talked about some of the specific acts and stuff that was put in specifically to really impose the social freedoms that black people would have with people in the South, specifically, and the white Southerners and the aristocracy, in order to give them their rights and protect their functional constitutional rights ultimately as citizens with the 14th Amendment. And it's just a lot of things that are all going on, and you're asking Andrew Johnson to basically rebuild this country, and I get that, and it's hard, but at the same time, it's your job, and you shouldn't have taken the vice presidency if you're going to not be able to uphold the duties of the office that you're being asked to do. If I could end on one final note, I will say this. I think his legacy is cemented, unfortunately for him, as a failure of a president. He will always be one of the lowest ranked presidents within this country's history, and I think he has very fair reasons and reality for the reasons why he failed. Specifically, a lot of them were because of him. That being said, Andrew Johnson, to me, is the pinnacle and genuine reality of two sides of the spectrum in a lot of ways, in terms of an argument. One side's going to say he's just a devout racist. He's just basically someone who, he had a particular perspective. He had a particular intellectual and oratory capability, and he lived a life that was very functionally different than a lot of people, and had an upbringing that was very functionally different from a lot of people. And ultimately, because of that upbringing, because of a lot of those things, he was always going to be, the person that he was always going to be in terms of his outlook on black people, slavery, etc., etc. And because of who he was, because you can ascribe a lot of it to his personal weakness, because, he probably felt like he didn't want to be a weak leader and wanted to be someone who wanted to do what he believed in, and that was defend the Constitution at the cost of many people's lives, livelihood, and rights that were being aggressively violated in consternation with other people's, in consternation of trying to protect a whole bunch of other people's constitutional rights, specifically with the white Southerners in the South. And he will always be looked at as someone as a failure of the Reconstruction period, and as someone who failed in every regard to basically protect the Constitution while protecting the Constitution, if that makes any sense. And then on the other side, there's a reality where the radical Republicans were basically trying to be, I guess, in one way, shape, and form, brutal and unscrupulous, and vindicate the hatred, or in vindication for all the things that the South had done for, and that Johnson attempted to be a humane, liberal kind of statesman who attempted to preserve the Constitution and democracy to try and stop basically the South from being exploited and destroyed, in fairness, by North and the Northern businessman enterprise, etc., whatever you want to call it. For the most part, there is a reason beyond losing the Civil War that the South is going to have a functional hatred of the North, and that there's going to be a lot of problems in the North for many decades and many years to come. There is a reason for that, and you have to understand that. And there's a big reason why the Republicans are going to be very complicated, despite being on the right side of history within the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, and ultimately for the next 30 or 40 years, it's going to be very difficult for Republicans, I think. And I think their history should, they don't want to talk about this part of history, which is why they always talk about Abraham Lincoln, etc., etc. But ultimately, there's two sides to every story. And I think Andrew Johnson deserves to have both sides told, because if we're going to be honest about history, then we should be honest about Andrew Johnson and his history. And the truth is that it's complicated, and that he did fail, and that should not be forgotten. But there are reasons why people fail, and there are reasons why, certain presidents succeed, certain people succeed, and ultimately, things were looking on the up and up by the time he left office. Grant was going to be the president. The economy was looking better and recovering in a lot of ways. And, despite his stopping of a whole bunch of different things, the political battles that were going back and forth, as he felt he was trying to protect the Southern whites, and the Congress was protecting the black Republicans. Checks and balances, baby. Checks and balances. What is known is that history will forever be changed because of Andrew Johnson as the 17th President of the United States of America. Thank you guys for listening, and if you guys want to listen to the next episode, please listen. Thank you.